Have you ever imagined receiving a letter that was mailed before you were even born? Not a copy. Not a family document. The original envelope. Still sealed. Still carrying the handwriting of someone the world believed had been forgotten forever. For 78 years it traveled through history. Wars ended. Countries changed. Entire generations disappeared. Yet somehow that single letter survived everything. When the mail carrier placed the worn envelope into Margaret's trembling hands, she almost threw it away. It looked like another piece of junk mail. Another mistake. Another reminder that old age often comes with confusion. Lynn. Her eyes stopped on one single line written in faded blue ink. Name. It was a name she had spent her entire life hearing in whispered conversations. A soldier who had vanished during the Second World War. A man declared dead. A fiancé who never came home. A love story that history buried without ever giving it an ending. Inside that forgotten envelope waited words that no one had read for nearly 8 decades. Words capable of changing everything her family believed about the past. And before this story ends, you may find yourself wondering how many forgotten lives are still hidden inside unopened letters somewhere in the world. This is the story of the last letter that arrived 78 years too late. And the name that changed an entire family's history forever. My name is Margaret Collins, and I was 86 years old when the past finally knocked on my front door. By then, I believed life had already shown me every surprise it had left. My husband had been gone for 11 years. My children lived in different states. My grandchildren visited whenever work and school allowed. Most of my mornings followed the same quiet rhythm. I watered the flowers on the porch, brewed a small pot of coffee, read a few pages from whatever history book sat on my table, and waited for the mail truck that always arrived shortly after 10. It had become less about expecting letters and more about holding on to routine. At my age, routine is a strange kind of comfort. It reminds you that another ordinary day has begun, and sometimes ordinary days are the greatest gift a person can receive. That Tuesday looked no different. The sky was covered by soft gray clouds, and a cool breeze carried the smell of rain across the neighborhood. I heard the familiar sound of the postal truck stopping in front of my house. The young mail carrier, Ethan, smiled as he placed a small stack of envelopes inside my mailbox. He waved. I waved back. Nothing unusual. At least that's what I believed. I carried the letters into the kitchen and laid them beside my coffee mug. Electricity bill. Pharmacy advertisement. Church newsletter. Catalog I never remembered subscribing to. Then my fingers touched the last envelope. Immediately, something felt different. The paper wasn't smooth like modern envelopes. It was thick, rough, almost fragile. Its edges had darkened with age, and the corners looked as though they had survived decades inside forgotten boxes and dusty shelves. Across the front were dozens of faded postal stamps layered over one another, each from a different decade. Some were nearly impossible to read. Others carried dates that made no sense. 1947, 1953, 1968, 1985, 1999, 2016. It looked as though the letter had spent a lifetime traveling from one forgotten warehouse to another, never quite reaching its destination. First I laughed quietly. Someone at the post office really made a mess. I assumed it belonged in a museum, not in my kitchen. The return address was barely visible. Fort Benning, Georgia. The sender's name had almost disappeared beneath layers of ink and time. Only a few letters remained readable. Thomas. Nothing else. The recipient was written in beautiful cursive handwriting. Miss Eleanor Whitmore. 326 Willow Street, Ashford. The problem was simple. I wasn't Eleanor. I had never lived on Willow Street. And there wasn't even an Ashford in my county. Somewhere during nearly 8 decades, the letter had wandered into the wrong hands. I reached for the trash can. Not because I wanted to destroy history, because I assumed the post office had made another mistake. Then I noticed something unusual. Below the address, written in much smaller handwriting, someone had added another note many years later. If recipient cannot be located, Please forward to next surviving family member. There was no signature. Only that sentence. My hand stopped in the air. Surviving family member. I frowned. Who writes something like that on an envelope? Curiosity slowly replaced indifference. I walked into the living room, grabbed my reading glasses, and sat beside the window where the afternoon light made faded writing easier to read. That's when I noticed another detail. Near the lower corner was a military seal. Not printed. Embossed directly into the paper. It had nearly vanished with age, but enough remained to recognize it. United States Army Postal Service. The date beneath it made my heart skip. November 1945. Just months after World War II had ended. I stared at the envelope for a long time. My father had served in Europe. My uncle had fought in France. Growing up, nearly every family gathering eventually became a conversation about the war. Places. Friends who never returned. Letters that stopped arriving. Promises that were never fulfilled. Every American family of that generation carried stories like those. Some ended happily. Many never found an ending at all. Perhaps this was one of those stories. I considered taking the envelope back to the post office the following morning. Surely someone there would know what to do with it. But another thought entered my mind. If the letter had failed to reach its destination for 78 years, what exactly could the post office accomplish now? Most of the people involved were almost certainly gone. The sender, the intended recipient, even the original postal workers. History had already claimed them. Outside, rain finally began tapping softly against the windows. I turned the envelope over. The wax seal had broken decades earlier. Someone had apparently intended to open it at some point. Strangely, the flap remained closed, almost untouched. It was as though dozens of people had held the letter, examined it, forwarded it, stamped it, ordered it, forgotten it, and still, somehow, no one had actually read what was inside. I ran my fingertips across the brittle paper. Part of me knew I should leave it alone. Another part whispered something impossible. Maybe this letter had reached exactly where it was always meant to arrive. I smiled at my own imagination. Old age has a way of making people believe in strange coincidences. I carried the envelope into my small study, where shelves filled with history books covered nearly every wall. My late husband used to joke that I trusted old paper more than television. Perhaps he was right. I placed the envelope carefully beside an old desk lamp, and decided to search for one simple thing before making any decisions. Who was Eleanor Whitmore? I opened my laptop, typed the name, pressed enter, and within seconds, my quiet Tuesday disappeared forever. Search engines are remarkable tools, but they often create the illusion that every life has been preserved somewhere online. Most of the time, that simply isn't true, especially when you're searching for ordinary people who lived through extraordinary times. I typed Eleanor Whitmore. Thousands of results appeared. None of them seemed connected to the woman whose name rested on the aging envelope beside my keyboard. I tried adding quotation marks. Nothing. Then I searched for Eleanor Whitmore World War II. Again, nothing useful. For a moment, I almost closed the laptop. Maybe she had simply lived a quiet life, leaving behind no digital footprint. Most people born before the 1920s had. Still, something kept pulling me forward. I narrowed the search. Eleanor Whitmore Ashford. This time, one result caught my attention. Not a news article. Not a family tree. A scanned city directory from 1946. Uploaded by a small historical society. Clicked it. The page took several seconds to load, revealing hundreds of faded names listed alphabetically. Slowly I scrolled down. Wilson. Winter. Withers. Whitaker. Whitmore. My heart skipped. There it was. Whitmore Eleanor M. 326 Willow Street. Ashford. The exact address written on the envelope. For the first time that day, the letter stopped feeling like a postal mistake. It had belonged to someone real. Someone who had stood on that street waiting for news almost 80 years earlier. I leaned back in my chair. The silence inside the house suddenly felt heavier. I imagined a young woman opening her mailbox every afternoon, hoping another military letter had arrived. Perhaps she had counted the days. Perhaps she had memorized the sound of the mail truck just as I had. Perhaps every knock on the door carried hope. Then, nothing. The war ended. The letters stopped. Life moved on. Or at least everyone expected it to. Curiosity became something stronger now. Responsibility. If this letter had somehow survived 78 years, didn't its story deserve to be understood? I searched again. This time I looked for the town itself. Ashford wasn't far away. Less than 90 miles from where I lived. Quiet. Its population had been shrinking for decades. There was even a local historical museum run mostly by volunteers. I copied the phone number onto a notepad but hesitated before calling. Instead I kept searching. After nearly 20 minutes, another record appeared. A newspaper archive. The page was badly scanned, and many words were impossible to read, but one headline remained perfectly clear. Local soldier still missing. The article dated back to February 1946. I enlarged the image until the letters blurred. Slowly, sentence by sentence, I pieced together what remained. A young army sergeant named Thomas Whitmore had failed to return after the war despite official reports declaring hostilities over months earlier. His family continued hoping he might still be alive somewhere in Europe. My eyes drifted back toward the envelope. The faded return address. Fort Benning. The partial sender's name. Thomas. Could it be the same man? The article continued with one sentence that made the room feel colder. His fiancée, Miss Eleanor Whitmore, refused to believe he had died despite receiving no communication for several months. Fiancée, not wife. I frowned. That didn't make sense. If they shared the same last name before marriage, something was wrong. Either the newspaper contained an error, or my assumption did. I looked closer. The scan quality was terrible. The faded print might not say Whitmore after all. I enlarged it again. The letters shifted into focus. Not Whitmore. Whitman. I actually laughed out loud. One blurry letter had completely changed the story. Thomas Whitmore. Eleanor Whitman. Engaged. Never married. Because he never came home. Closed my eyes. How many lives had remained suspended between hope and grief after that war? Too many. Far too many. I thought of my own parents. My father rarely spoke about Europe. When he did, he always said the hardest part wasn't the fighting. It was the waiting families back home. The mothers. The wives. The children. Every telegram had the power to destroy an entire future. Yet Eleanor apparently received neither closure nor explanation. Just silence. Now, after 78 years, one forgotten envelope had appeared on my kitchen table. I reached for it again. Its paper felt impossibly delicate. I turned it over once more, studying every stamp, every handwritten note, every faded mark left by generations of postal workers who had unknowingly become guardians of someone else's unfinished story. Then I noticed something I had somehow missed before. Very lightly penciled across the back flap were 4 words. Do not return sender. Not printed. Handwritten. Different ink. Different handwriting. Added later. I stared at those words for nearly a full minute. Why would someone write that? If the sender couldn't receive it back, then where had Thomas been? And who had decided the letter should keep traveling instead of returning to the army? Questions multiplied faster than answers. For the first time that afternoon, I realized this was no longer just about delivering a forgotten letter. Someone, somewhere along its impossible journey, had deliberately kept it moving, almost as though they believed. One day, it would finally reach the person who needed to read it. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. Not because of the letter. At least that was what I told myself. I tried following my normal routine. I made breakfast, watered the roses along the porch, fed the birds that gathered beneath the old maple tree, and listened to the morning news without actually hearing a single word. My eyes kept drifting toward the study. toward the envelope resting beneath the desk lamp. It felt as though another person had spent the night inside my house. Not physically, but through the weight of unfinished history. By 8:30, I had convinced myself that the best course of action was to call the Ashford Historical Society. If anyone still remembered Eleanor Whitman or Sergeant Thomas Whitmore, it would be them. The number I had written the day before was still lying beside the computer. Picked up the phone. A cheerful voice answered after only 2 rings. Ashford Historical Society. This is Helen. She sounded elderly. Gentle. Exactly the kind of voice one expects from someone who spends her days protecting old photographs and forgotten stories. My name is Margaret Collins, I said. I know this is going to sound strange, but I believe I have a letter that was mailed to someone in Ashford almost 80 years ago. There was silence. Not confused silence. Interested silence. Finally she asked softly, "How old is the letter?" Postmarked November of 1945. Another pause. Longer this time. When Helen spoke again, her voice had changed completely. "Please don't throw it away. I wasn't planning to." "Good." She inhaled slowly before continuing. "Can you tell me the name written on the envelope?" "Eleanor Whitman." I heard papers moving on the other end. Drawers opening. Perhaps file cabinets. Oh my goodness. The words were almost whispered. "You know that name." "I do." My heartbeat quickened. "Who was she?" Helen didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked a question of her own. "Would you mind telling me the return address?" "Fort Benning." "And the sender?" "It's faded. I can only make out the first name." "Thomas." Another long silence followed. When Helen finally spoke, she sounded almost emotional. "I think you should come to Ashford. I live about 90 miles away. I know that's a long drive. What can you tell me over the phone?" "I'm afraid. Not enough." Her hesitation wasn't theatrical. Sounded genuine. "As strange as this may seem," she continued, "our museum has an entire display dedicated to Sergeant Thomas Whitmore." Froze. An entire display. For one soldier. What happened to him? We know part of the story. And the rest? We've been trying to understand the rest for almost 80 years. A chill ran across my arms. She couldn't possibly know what was inside the envelope. No one could. Yet somehow, her words made it sound as though the letter itself might answer questions the town had carried for generations. "I don't understand," I admitted. "You will. Has anyone ever mentioned this letter before?" "No." "Then how can you be so certain?" Helen sighed. "Because Thomas Whitmore disappeared without sending what everyone believed would be his final letter." The room became perfectly still. My eyes slowly turned toward the envelope. I hadn't told her it appeared unopened. I hadn't told her the wax seal remained almost intact. Somehow, she already suspected. "Mrs. Collins." "Yes. Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Have you opened it?" "No. Please don't." That surprised me. "I thought you'd want to know what it says." "I do. So why shouldn't I read it?" "Because if it truly is the letter we've spent decades wondering about." She stopped herself. "Then I think it deserves witnesses." "Witnesses?" "The people whose lives it may still affect." I almost smiled. "Helen, after 78 years, surely there can't be anyone left." "Oh, there are." Her answer came instantly. "Thomas had no children. But his younger brother did. And Eleanor. She eventually married another man." My heart sank. I suppose life had to go on. Yes. But according to everyone who knew her. Helen's voice grew softer. A part of her remained waiting for Thomas until the day she died. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Outside, a lawn mower hummed somewhere down the street. The ordinary sounds of life felt strangely disconnected from the conversation unfolding in my kitchen. Finally, I asked the question that had been haunting me since yesterday. Why did the letter keep traveling? Helen answered with complete honesty. We don't know. It should have been returned. It wasn't. It should have been archived. It wasn't. It should have disappeared. It almost did. What do you mean? About 12 years ago, an old postal warehouse outside Atlanta was being emptied before demolition. I leaned forward. Go on. Thousands of undelivered letters were discovered. I heard about stories like that. So did everyone else. But most of those letters had no surviving recipients. And this one. We were told one addressed to Eleanor Whitman had been found. My breath caught. You knew about it. We knew it existed. Then why wasn't it delivered? Because it disappeared again. What? It vanished during the transfer. No one could explain how. For years we assumed it had finally been destroyed. She laughed quietly. I suppose history had other plans. I stared at the envelope lying across my desk. Its long journey suddenly seemed even more unbelievable. Not only had it survived wars, fires, warehouse closures, postal reorganizations, and the passing of nearly 8 decades, it had disappeared once, only to reappear years later in the hands of someone who had never even heard the names Thomas Whitmore or Eleanor Whitman. Coincidence. That's what I wanted to call it. Yet the older I became, the less certain I was that every remarkable event could be explained by coincidence alone. Before ending the call, Helen asked one final favor. If you're willing. I am. Bring the letter here. I'll leave this afternoon. We'll be waiting. As I hung up the phone, I looked once more at the faded handwriting on the envelope. For 78 years, the letter had searched for its destination. No, for the first time. It felt as though its destination was searching for it. I had not driven to Ashford in more than 30 years. In fact, I wasn't even sure why I had gone there the first time. Perhaps it had been during a summer road trip with my husband. Perhaps we had simply passed through on our way somewhere else. Like so many small American towns, Ashford existed quietly between larger places, rarely appearing on maps unless someone had a reason to look for it. Now, somehow, one forgotten letter had become my reason. I packed the envelope inside a hard plastic document case, wrapped it carefully in a clean cotton cloth, and placed both inside a leather satchel my husband had once carried to work. The paper had survived nearly 8 decades. I wasn't about to let anything happen to it during a 90-mile drive. Before leaving, I stood in front of the hallway mirror. You've lost your mind, Margaret, I told my reflection with a smile. At 86, most people drove to doctor's appointments. I was driving toward a mystery that had begun before I was born. The roads were quiet. Rain from the previous evening had washed the dust from the trees, leaving the countryside bright with early summer green. Farms stretched across rolling hills. Old barns leaned slightly with age. Small churches appeared every few miles, their white steeples rising above fields that had probably looked much the same in 1945. I found myself thinking about Thomas. Had he driven roads like these before leaving for the army? Had Eleanor stood on a porch waving goodbye, believing they would marry within months? Neither of them could have imagined that 78 years later, two strangers would be trying to finish a story they had never been allowed to complete. Just outside Ashford, I noticed a weathered roadside sign. Welcome to Ashford. Population 2,143. Someone had painted small American flags along the bottom edge. The paint was fading. The pride wasn't. The town looked exactly as I imagined. Brick storefronts, wide sidewalks, old maple trees. A courthouse with a clock tower. It felt less like entering a new place and more like stepping into another decade. The Historical Society occupied what had once been the town's public library. The building itself looked almost as old as the envelope waiting inside my satchel. When I stepped through the front doors, the smell greeted me first. Old paper. Wood polish. History has a scent of its own. An elderly woman stood behind a reception desk, organizing photographs inside clear plastic sleeves. She looked up immediately. You must be Margaret. I suppose word travels fast. She laughed. In a town this size, everything does. She walked around the desk and shook my hand with surprising strength. I'm Helen. She was probably close to my own age. Silver hair. Bright blue eyes. The kind of smile that instantly made strangers feel welcome. I can't tell you how grateful we are that you came. I wasn't sure whether I should. You made the right decision. She glanced toward my satchel. Is it with you? He nodded. It hasn't left my side. For a moment, neither of us reached for it. Oddly enough, it felt almost disrespectful to hand it over casually, as though it were an ordinary piece of mail instead of something that had outlived almost everyone connected to it. Helen seemed to understand. We're not going to rush. She led me through several exhibition rooms. The museum was modest but lovingly maintained. There were Civil War uniforms, railroad maps, photographs of local families, school yearbooks, handwritten diaries. Every object represented someone whose ordinary life had eventually become history. Finally, we stopped in front of a display enclosed in glass. Above it hung a simple wooden plaque. Sergeant Thomas Whitmore, 1922. Missing in action. The words caught me off guard. Not killed. Not died. Simply missing. Inside the display rested several personal belongings. A military cap. A worn Bible. A photograph of a smiling young man in uniform. A faded dance ticket dated April 1944. A newspaper clipping announcing his enlistment. And beside it, a black and white photograph of a young woman. She couldn't have been older than 20. Dark hair. Gentle smile. Eyes filled with the kind of hope only youth seems able to carry without effort. A small handwritten label identified her. Eleanor Whitman. I stared at the photograph much longer than I expected. Without realizing it, I had imagined Eleanor dozens of different ways during the drive. None of them resembled the real woman. There was something remarkably peaceful about her face. The expression of someone who believed the future had already been planned. She had no way of knowing history was about to rewrite every expectation she possessed. Helen stood quietly beside me. They were engaged. Since the spring of 1944. He left soon afterward. She nodded. They planned to marry when he came home. I looked again at the photograph. They never had the chance. No. Helen hesitated before continuing. Eleanor never removed the engagement ring. I turned toward her. Even after she married someone else. According to her daughter. Helen smiled sadly. She wore Thomas's ring on a chain beneath her clothes for the rest of her life. I felt a lump form in my throat. People often speak of moving on as though it means forgetting. History rarely works that way. Sometimes people continue living while quietly carrying yesterday with them every single day. Helen gently touched the edge of the display case. There's something else you should know. What is it? This exhibit has always felt incomplete. Because of the missing letter. She nodded. We have photographs. We have army records. We have newspaper reports. We even have witness statements from men who served beside Thomas. But we never had his own words. I slowly opened my satchel. Carefully. Almost ceremonially. The plastic document case reflected the overhead lights as I placed it on a nearby wooden table. Helen's breathing became noticeably slower. Neither of us spoke. I unfolded the cotton cloth. The aged envelope appeared between us once again. For several seconds, Helen simply stared. Then tears quietly filled her eyes. I never truly believed I'd live long enough to see it. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. She reached toward the envelope, then stopped only inches away. I don't think, she said softly, I should be the first person to touch it. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The envelope rested on the old oak table as though it had finally reached a place where time itself had decided to slow down. Helen stood with her hands folded in front of her. I noticed they were trembling. Not from age. From the realization that something she had spent decades believing was lost forever was now only a few inches away. Finally she looked at me. I think someone else should be here. Who? The Whitmore family. And Eleanor's family. She lowered her eyes. There aren't many left. Do they still live here? A few. She walked quietly to a desk near the wall and picked up an old address book filled with handwritten notes. No one expected this day to come, she admitted. We've always hoped. But hope and expectation are different things. She dialed the first number. An answering machine. The second. No answer. Third. Someone picked up. David. A smile appeared across her face. It's Helen. No, nothing's wrong. Actually. She glanced toward me and the envelope. I need you to come to the museum. I know you're working. Yes. It's about your Uncle Thomas. Silence. Then she added only 4 words. We found the letter. Even from across the room, I could hear the man on the other end stop speaking. The silence itself became an answer. Helen listened quietly before smiling again. I'll see you soon. She hung up and exhaled slowly. He's coming. Who is he? Thomas's nephew. I thought you said Thomas had no children. He didn't. David is the son of Thomas's younger brother, William. He nodded. So someone in the family is still alive. More than someone. She smiled warmly. David has spent nearly 20 years preserving his uncle's memory. I looked again toward the exhibit. He built this. Most of it. He donated almost everything you see. The military cap, the photographs, the Bible, the newspaper clippings. They all came from David. Something about that touched me deeply. Many people inherit money. Some inherit houses. David Whitmore had inherited someone else's absence. While we waited, Helen invited me into a small archive room behind the museum. Metal shelves lined every wall. Gray archival boxes were stacked from floor to ceiling. Thousands of names. Thousands of forgotten lives. She carefully removed one box labeled simply, Whitmore. Inside were dozens of carefully preserved documents. Army correspondence. Insurance forms. Birth certificates. Telegram copies. Newspaper interviews. Everything had been organized with extraordinary care. This is decades of work, I said. It is. You did all this. We all did. She smiled. Our volunteers. The families. People who believed forgotten stories still matter. I gently lifted one photograph from its protective sleeve. Thomas stood beside 3 other soldiers. All were smiling. None of them looked frightened. None looked like young men about to witness war. They looked like friends on an ordinary afternoon. One had his arm around Thomas's shoulder. Another held a baseball glove. The photograph could have been taken at a neighborhood picnic instead of an army base. War always changes photographs after the fact. Once you know what comes later, every smile becomes heartbreaking. Helen noticed where I was looking. Only one of those 4 came home. I swallowed quietly. I've read statistics my entire life. She nodded. But statistics never feel real. Until they become faces. Exactly. She handed me another document. This one carried the official army letter sent to Thomas's parents. The paper had yellowed with age. The language was painfully formal. We regret to inform you. Every American family of that generation dreaded those words. Yet something surprised me. The letter never stated Thomas had died. Only that communication had been lost. Status unknown. Missing. Pending further investigation. No final answer. No certainty. Just endless waiting. How long did they keep searching? Yes. Helen looked toward the ceiling for a moment, trying to remember. Officially. About 4 years. And unofficially. She smiled sadly. His mother searched until the day she died. I closed the folder gently. No parent should have to spend an entire lifetime wondering whether a child suffered, or survived, or simply disappeared into history. The front door of the museum opened. Footsteps echoed across the wooden floor. Helen looked toward the hallway. That'll be David. A tall man entered the archive room. He appeared to be in his late 60s. Broad shoulders, gray hair, work boots still covered with dust. He had clearly come directly from wherever Helen's phone call had interrupted him. He smiled politely at me. "You must be Margaret." "I am." He extended his hand. "David Whitmore." His handshake was firm but distracted. His eyes never stayed on me for more than a second. They kept drifting toward the envelope resting on the nearby table. Helen spoke softly. "That's it." David took one slow step forward. Then another. When he finally stood beside the envelope, he didn't touch it. "Is it?" He removed his cap. No one had asked him to. It was simply the gesture that felt right. He stared at the faded handwriting for several long seconds. Then something unexpected happened. The large, weathered man standing before us quietly began to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just silent tears that seemed to have been waiting most of his life. "My grandmother," he whispered, "used to pray every Sunday that this letter would somehow be found." His voice broke. "I thought it was just something people said." He looked at me. I never believed it actually existed. Neither Helen nor I interrupted him. Some moments deserve silence more than words. David carefully leaned closer. His eyes traced the faded ink, the military seal, postmarks, the worn edges. Then he suddenly froze. His expression changed. He pointed toward the lower left corner of the envelope. "I know this handwriting." Helen frowned. "What?" "This isn't just Thomas's writing." He leaned even closer. "No," he whispered. "Someone else wrote on this envelope after he mailed it." I looked where he was pointing. Until that moment, I had barely noticed the tiny pencil marks hidden beneath one of the old postal stamps. David's face had turned pale. "I've seen these initials before." He slowly lifted his eyes toward us. "They belonged," he said quietly, "to the army officer who was the last person ever known to see my uncle alive." For several seconds no one spoke. The only sound inside the archive room came from the old wall clock, its steady ticking suddenly seeming much louder than before. David continued staring at the tiny pencil marks beneath the faded postal stamp. His finger hovered just above the paper without touching it. "I haven't seen these initials in nearly 50 years, he said quietly. Helen stepped closer. "What initials?" "J.R.M. She narrowed her eyes. "They're almost impossible to see. They were never meant to be seen." I adjusted my glasses and leaned over the table. Now that David had pointed them out, I could just barely distinguish 3 tiny letters pressed into the paper with a dull graphite pencil. "Jerem. So you recognize them?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. "My father showed them to me when I was a boy." "On another letter?" "No. On an investigation report." He took a deep breath before continuing. "The initials belonged to Captain James Richard Monroe, the officer who commanded my uncle's company during the final weeks of the war." Helen looked genuinely surprised. "I've catalogued these records for 30 years. I don't remember seeing that." "Because the report wasn't here." David smiled faintly. "It stayed in my family's attic until after my father died." He walked toward one of the archive shelves. "Helen, do you still have the Whitmore investigation binder?" She immediately knew which one he meant. Without hesitation, she removed a thick blue binder from the second shelf. The cover showed signs of decades of use. Inside were photocopies of military documents, newspaper articles, handwritten notes, and transcripts from interviews conducted long after the war. David turned page after page with remarkable confidence. He knew exactly where he was going. Finally he stopped. "There." He placed the binder in front of us. A faded army memorandum filled the page. Near the bottom appeared a signature. Captain James Richard Monroe. And beside it, the same initials. Jerem. They matched perfectly. The shape of the letters. The slight slant. Even the unusual way the R curved downward before turning back. There was no doubt. "They're identical," Helen whispered. David nodded. "I'd recognize them anywhere." I looked back toward the envelope. So Captain Monroe handled this letter. Apparently. But why? No idea. He wasn't a postal officer. He commanded infantry. I frowned. Then how did his handwriting end up on an undelivered letter? None of us had an answer. David carefully turned another page inside the binder. This is why I remembered. The document was an interview recorded in 1974. Someone had questioned Captain Monroe nearly 30 years after the war. Most of the answers were brief. Routine. Expected. Then one question stood out. Did Sergeant Thomas Whitmore leave any personal belongings? Monroe's answer had been typed beneath. Only his watch and several personal papers. No letters were recovered. David tapped the sentence gently. No letters. He looked at the envelope. And yet, there was clearly at least one. I finished the thought for him. Helen slowly sat down. If Monroe believed there were no letters, then why did he write on this one? Exactly. The contradiction hung over the room. History rarely changes. Documents don't usually argue with each other. Yet here they were. One official report claiming no letters existed. One actual letter proving otherwise. Someone had been wrong. Or someone had deliberately hidden the truth. David reached into his jacket pocket. I almost forgot. He removed an old black and white photograph folded inside a protective sleeve. I carry this everywhere. The picture showed 6 soldiers standing beside a military truck. Thomas was one of them. David pointed toward the tallest man in the group. That's Captain Monroe. I studied his face carefully. Square jaw, thin mustache, calm expression. Nothing about him suggested mystery. He looked like countless officers whose photographs filled history books. Ordinary, respectable, dependable. Yet somehow his initials had ended up on a letter no one was ever supposed to see. Helen crossed her arms. I don't like coincidences. David smiled. My father didn't either. What did he think happened? He never knew. But he always believed someone interfered with Thomas's mail. I raised an eyebrow. Based on what? David searched through another folder before handing me a handwritten notebook. The pages were filled with careful cursive writing. My grandmother's diary. The mother of Thomas and William. I opened to a page marked with a faded ribbon. The date read, January 18, 1946. The handwriting shook slightly, as though written through exhaustion. Thomas promised he would write every week. The letters stopped. The army says no more were found. But a mother knows when something isn't true. Someone is keeping my son's words from us. I looked up slowly. She believed that. Until the day she died. David nodded. My father used to say she never accepted the official explanation. Helen gently closed the diary. Most people thought grief had made her suspicious. David looked toward the envelope. Maybe she wasn't suspicious. Maybe. He whispered. She was right. The room fell silent again. I realized something that none of us had mentioned. If Thomas had written this letter, and if Captain Monroe had handled it, then someone had made a decision. A human decision. Letters do not hide themselves. Envelopes do not wander across 80 years without help. Or, some point, someone had chosen that this message should never reach Eleanor Whitman. The question was no longer whether the letter had been lost. The real question was far more unsettling. Who had wanted it to stay lost? And why? As those thoughts settled over us, the museum's front door opened once again. Helen looked toward the hallway. I invited one more person. Who? The only living resident of Ashford who actually remembers Eleanor. David's eyes widened. You mean? Helen nodded. Mrs. Rose Bennett. The woman who was Eleanor's closest friend. A slow smile crossed David's face. I didn't think she still left the nursing home. She almost never does. Helen looked toward the entrance. But when I told her the letter had finally arrived, she smiled softly. She said there was something she had waited 80 years to tell us. The hallway outside the archive room filled with the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps. Not the confident stride of someone arriving for an appointment. The careful rhythm of a person who had learned, over many years, that every step deserved respect. A wheelchair appeared first. Behind it walked a young nurse in light blue scrubs. Seated in the chair was a woman so small she seemed almost swallowed by the thick wool blanket covering her knees. Her white hair had been neatly combed. Her hands rested quietly in her lap. But her eyes were astonishing, bright, alert, filled with the unmistakable awareness of someone whose memories had outlived nearly everyone she had ever loved. Helen immediately crossed the room. "Rose." The elderly woman smiled. "I told you I'd come. You did. And I wasn't about to let history keep one more secret." David removed his cap again. "It's good to see you, Mrs. Bennet." She laughed softly. "You still call me Mrs. Bennet. I've known you since I was a little boy. And you'll always be that little boy to me." Only then did she notice me. Helen gently introduced us. "This is Margaret Collins, the woman who received the letter." Rose looked directly into my eyes. There was no confusion, no hesitation. She simply reached out her hand. I took it carefully. "Thank you," she whispered, "for bringing her home." The words caught me off guard. "Home?" Rose nodded toward the envelope. "That letter has been trying to come home for a very long time." No one corrected her, because somehow felt true. The nurse quietly stepped aside, giving us privacy. Rose leaned slightly forward. "May I see it?" David looked toward Helen. Helen looked toward me. I slowly slid the envelope across the table until it rested within Rose's reach. She didn't pick it up immediately. Instead, she simply looked at it for nearly a full minute. Then her lips began to tremble. "I know this envelope." The room froze. David's voice became barely audible. "You've seen it before." She nodded. "Only once." "When?" "The day Thomas mailed it." Every person in the room leaned closer. Rose closed her eyes for a moment, as though searching through memories hidden beneath decades of time. "When you're 98 years old," she said quietly, "your memories don't disappear. They simply become harder to reach." She smiled faintly. "But that day, I've never forgotten." Her voice grew steadier. "It was late October. The war was ending. Eleanor and I walked together to the train station. We believed Thomas would be home before Christmas." He paused. "I remember laughing because Eleanor had spent nearly an hour deciding which dress to wear." David smiled through tears. "That sounds like her." Rose laughed softly. "Oh, she wanted everything to be perfect. She kept saying, 'The first thing Thomas sees when he comes home should be my smile.'" Silence settled over the room. Even the old wall clock seemed quieter now. Rose continued. "Thomas couldn't leave the military base that week. So he asked another soldier to carry the letter into town." She looked directly at the envelope. "I watched him hand it to the postal clerk." "You actually saw it mailed?" "I did. There were blue stamps on the counter. The clerk weighed it. Thomas paid a few extra cents because he wanted to be certain it reached Eleanor quickly." I exchanged a glance with Helen. If Rose's memory was accurate, the letter had entered the postal system normally. There had been no mistake at the beginning. Rose slowly reached toward the lower corner of the envelope. Without touching the paper, she pointed to the faded military seal. "That wasn't there." "What?" David frowned. "When I last saw this envelope, there was no military seal." Helen's eyes widened. "You're sure?" Rose nodded without hesitation. "Perfectly sure. I remember because Eleanor joked that Thomas had chosen the plainest envelope she'd ever seen." She smiled at the memory. Trust a soldier to save money on stationery, she said. We all looked toward the embossed army seal. It had clearly been added later, long after the letter had been mailed, which meant one thing. Somewhere between the post office and Eleanor's mailbox, the army had taken possession of a civilian letter. I spoke the thought aloud. That shouldn't have happened. No, Helen agreed. It absolutely shouldn't. David folded his arms. The military had no authority to intercept personal domestic mail after it entered the civilian postal system. Rose slowly nodded. Exactly. The certainty in her voice surprised me. You know that. My husband worked for the post office for 38 years. She smiled proudly. I learned more about mail than I ever wanted. A faint chuckle spread through the room. It lasted only a moment, because another thought quickly replaced it. If the army had intercepted the letter, someone had ordered it. And if someone had ordered it, there had to be a reason. Rose looked toward me again. May I ask something? Of course. You haven't opened it. No, she smiled. I knew you wouldn't. How? Because if someone had. She gently touched the edge of the flap. This paper wouldn't still be holding its breath. The phrase lingered in the room. Holding its breath. That was exactly how the envelope felt. As though it had spent 78 years waiting for permission to finish its journey. Rose leaned back in her wheelchair. There is one more thing. David immediately stepped closer. What is it? I never told anyone. Not even Eleanor. Her eyes filled with tears. Because I promised. Helen knelt beside her chair. Promised who? Rose looked once more at the faded handwriting. Then, almost in a whisper, she answered. Thomas. Every heartbeat in the room seemed to stop. He asked me to keep a secret, she said slowly. If anything ever happened to him. No one spoke. No one moved. Rose closed her eyes. I've carried that promise. For almost 80 years. Then she opened them again. And I think. She looked directly at the unopened envelope. It's finally time to break it. No one dared interrupt her. The room seemed to shrink around Rose Bennett as every pair of eyes remained fixed on her face. She was no longer simply an elderly woman recalling distant memories. She had become the last living bridge between our present and a world that had almost completely disappeared. Helen gently rested one hand on Rose's shoulder. You don't have to tell us anything that causes you pain. Rose smiled softly. My dear, she said. Pain stopped being the hardest part many years ago. What became harder was carrying silence. Those words settled heavily over all of us. David quietly pulled up a wooden chair and sat beside her. For the first time since arriving, he looked less like a historian and more like a little boy listening to stories from someone who had known his family before he existed. Rose folded her hands together. I was 19. Eleanor had just turned 20. We had been friends since grammar school. We shared everything. Our dreams. Our fears. Our first dances. Our first heartbreaks. When Thomas asked Eleanor to marry him, Rose smiled through watery eyes. I was the first person she told. She laughed quietly. Actually, she didn't tell me. She screamed. A few gentle smiles appeared around the room. I can still hear her running down Maple Street. Rose! Rose! He asked me. Rose shook her head, almost amused by the memory. She wasn't carrying the ring. She wasn't carrying flowers. She was carrying her shoes. She had taken them off because she couldn't run fast enough wearing heels. Even David laughed. I've never heard that story. Most people haven't. Rose looked toward the ceiling. So many little memories disappear when the people who lived them disappear. Her expression slowly became serious again. Thomas wasn't like most young men. What do you mean? He asked. He listened more than he talked. He read books. He repaired radios. He loved clocks. Whenever one stopped working, Rose smiled. He couldn't rest until he understood why. David nodded immediately. My father used to say Uncle Thomas could fix almost anything. He could, Rose agreed. But there was one thing he could never fix. What? The war. Silence returned. Rose took a slow breath before continuing. The last time I saw Thomas, he didn't look frightened. He looked, she searched for the right word. Unfinished. David frowned. What do you mean by unfinished? He behaved like a man trying to memorize ordinary life. She closed her eyes again. I remember every detail. The train station. The smell of coal. The steam. The soldiers laughing louder than usual. The wives pretending not to cry. The children waving tiny American flags. She smiled sadly. And Thomas. He wasn't looking at the train. He wasn't looking at the soldiers. He kept looking at Eleanor. As though he already knew. He might never see her again. I felt a chill run across my arms. Rose continued. Just before boarding, he walked over to me. He asked if we could speak privately. David leaned forward. You never told anyone that. I promised him I wouldn't. What did he say? Rose looked down at her folded hands. He reached into his coat and handed me something. What was it? A small silver key. The room became perfectly still. A key, I repeated. She nodded. He closed my fingers around it. And he said. Her voice softened as she repeated words she had carried for nearly 80 years. Rose, if I don't come home, don't give this to Eleanor. David looked confused. He didn't want her to have it. No. Wait. Only give it to her. If a letter ever fails to reach her. Every person in the room stared at Rose. I wasn't sure I had heard correctly. He connected the key, I said slowly, to a letter. Yes. And he specifically said, if a letter failed to reach Eleanor. Rose nodded once. Exactly. Helen looked genuinely stunned. How could he possibly know? I've asked myself that question for nearly 80 years. Rose answered quietly. He said something else. What? If the letter arrives, the key will never matter. If it doesn't, one day, someone will understand. No one spoke. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the museum windows. Sounded strangely familiar. Almost identical to the rain that had fallen the afternoon I first discovered the envelope. David slowly rubbed his forehead. This doesn't make sense. It didn't make sense in 1945 either, Rose admitted. I thought he was simply nervous. Young men leaving for war often said unusual things. So I promised. You kept the key. I did. For years. Then what happened to it? Rose smiled. I still have it. David's eyes widened. You still have it. My daughter keeps it locked inside my old cedar chest. Helen looked toward me. We've spent decades searching military records, interviewing veterans, reading newspapers. And all this time, she looked back at Rose. There was a key. Rose nodded gently. I never believed I'd need to give it away. I assumed the letter had arrived. I assumed Thomas had simply died before coming home. Her eyes slowly drifted toward the envelope once more. But when Helen called yesterday and said the letter had finally been found, I understood. My promise wasn't over. It had only been waiting. David stood slowly. We need that key. Rose smiled. I thought you might. She looked toward the young nurse standing patiently near the doorway. Emily. My purse. The nurse retrieved a small leather handbag hanging behind the wheelchair. Rose carefully opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper. She handed it to David. My daughter doesn't know what this means. But she knows if I ever asked for it, she should give me the cedar chest. David unfolded the paper. It contained nothing more than an address. And one handwritten sentence. The key is hidden beneath the false bottom. David looked up. False bottom? Rose nodded. Thomas built it himself. The room fell silent once again. The man who repaired clocks, who loved mechanisms, who had left behind a mysterious letter, had also built a hidden compartment to protect a key no one was supposed to find. I suddenly realized something. Neither the key, nor the envelope, had ever been intended to exist separately. They had always been parts of the same story. Somehow, after 78 years, both had survived. For a brief moment, none of us seemed capable of thinking about anything except the key. It was no longer just an old object hidden inside a cedar chest. It had become proof. Proof that Thomas Whitmore had expected something to happen before he ever disappeared. That single realization changed everything. Until now, we had assumed the missing letter was the mystery. Now it seemed the letter had only been one piece of a much larger puzzle. Rose quietly closed her handbag. I always wondered whether I had misunderstood him. You don't think that anymore? Yes. She smiled gently. No. I think I understood him perfectly. David remained standing, staring at the handwritten address in his hands. My mother still owns Grandma Rose's old house. Rose nodded. My daughter moved in after my husband passed away. The cedar chest is still there. It hasn't been opened in years. David looked toward Helen. We should go today. Helen agreed immediately. If the key has survived this long, we shouldn't leave it there another night. Rose chuckled softly. I don't think it's going anywhere. No, David smiled. But after everything we've learned, I'd rather not tempt fate. For the first time since arriving at the museum, the atmosphere felt lighter. Not because the mystery had become smaller, because we were finally moving forward. Instead of studying old records, we were about to follow a trail left by someone who had actually lived the story. Helen carefully lifted the envelope and returned it to its protective case. I'll keep this locked here until everyone comes back. David looked surprised. You don't want to bring it? She shook her head. No. If Thomas intended the key and the letter to meet again, they've already waited 78 years. They can wait another hour. No one argued. The museum closed early that afternoon. Helen hung a small handwritten sign on the front door. Closed for historical preservation. Smiled. Technically it wasn't a lie. We climbed into David's pickup truck. Ashford looked even quieter in the afternoon. Children rode bicycles along empty sidewalks. An elderly man swept the entrance to his barber shop. A church bell rang somewhere across town. Life continued exactly as it had the day before. Completely unaware that one forgotten letter had awakened an 80-year-old mystery. As we drove, David pointed toward various streets. My father grew up over there. Thomas used to deliver newspapers along this block. That's the school where Eleanor taught first grade after the war. Every building carried someone's memory. Every corner seemed connected to a story. Eventually, we turned onto a narrow street lined with old oak trees. Rose looked out the window. They're much bigger now. They were tiny when Thomas planted them. David glanced toward her. He planted these. 7 of them. 1 for each boy from Ashford who enlisted together. I counted silently. There were only 4 trees remaining. Rose noticed. Storms, she whispered. And time. We stopped in front of a modest white farmhouse. The porch sagged slightly with age. Flower boxes rested beneath every window. Wind chimes swayed gently beneath the roof. It felt like a house that had learned how to age gracefully. A woman in her early 70s opened the front door before we even reached it. She hurried down the steps. Mother, Rose smiled. Hello, Susan. The embrace between them lasted longer than words could have. When they finally separated, Susan looked toward the rest of us. So? She smiled nervously. The letter is real. Helen nodded. It is. Susan closed her eyes for a second. I've heard that story my entire life. I never believed I'd actually see this day. She invited us inside. The house felt warm, comfortable. Photographs covered nearly every wall. Generations of birthdays, Christmas gatherings, graduations, ordinary moments carefully preserved. Rose pointed toward the living room. The chest is upstairs. Susan hesitated. I haven't opened it since Dad died. You'll need the old brass key. I know where it is. She disappeared upstairs. None of us spoke while we waited. The silence wasn't awkward. Carried expectation. A few minutes later, footsteps echoed across the hallway. Susan returned carrying a small brass key in one hand. It still works. Together we climbed the narrow staircase. The second floor looked almost untouched. Rose's old sewing room remained exactly as she remembered it. Family quilts rested neatly folded across a wooden bench. Pressed flowers still hung inside faded frames. At the far end of the bedroom stood a large cedar chest. Dark wood, hand-carved corners, beautiful craftsmanship. Rose smiled the moment she saw it. He made that too. David stopped walking. Thomas built the chest. He finished it 3 weeks before leaving. I looked closer. The workmanship was extraordinary. Every joint fit perfectly. The carved floral patterns looked almost alive beneath decades of polish. He wanted Eleanor to have one just like it after they married. Rose whispered, "Is it?" He built mine first to practice. David slowly inserted the brass key. The old lock clicked almost immediately. The lid opened with a long, soft creak. Inside lay neatly folded blankets, letters, family photographs, and beneath everything, the unmistakable scent of cedar that had somehow survived generations. Rose pointed toward the bottom. Lift the quilt. Susan carefully folded the blankets aside. Then another layer. And another. Finally, the wooden floor of the chest became visible. There, Rose whispered. Near the back. First I saw nothing unusual. Then David knelt beside the chest. His fingertips gently traced the grain of the wood. Suddenly, he smiled. I think I found it. He pressed lightly against what appeared to be an ordinary knot in the cedar. A soft click echoed inside the room. The entire bottom panel shifted upward. Less than half an inch. A hidden compartment. Exactly where Rose had said it would be. No one breathed. David carefully lifted the false bottom. Inside rested a small cloth pouch, untouched by time. He picked it up with both hands. It weighed almost nothing. Slowly, very slowly. He untied the faded cotton string. The pouch opened. A tiny silver key slid gently into his palm. But it wasn't alone. Folded beneath it, hidden for nearly 8 decades, was another piece of paper. And unlike the letter waiting back at the museum, this one had Thomas Whitmore's signature clearly visible across the bottom. No one reached for the folded paper. Not immediately. It rested inside David's open hand beside the small silver key, as though both objects had spent nearly 80 years waiting for this exact moment. The room had become impossibly quiet. Outside, somewhere beyond the bedroom window, birds continued singing as though history were not unfolding inside the old farmhouse. Rose was the first to speak. I never knew there was anything else in there. Her voice carried genuine surprise. I thought Thomas only hid the key. David carefully lifted the folded note. The paper was much smaller than the envelope waiting back at the museum. Unlike the letter, this one had been folded several times into a tight square. Its edges remained remarkably clean, protected by the cedar chest and the cloth pouch. Helen leaned closer. Can you see what it says? Not yet. David turned it over. Across the outside, written in dark fountain pen ink, appeared only 6 words. To whoever finds the key. No name, no date, no address. Just that single sentence. A message written for strangers. Or perhaps, for the future. I felt something tighten in my chest. Thomas hadn't expected this note to be found by Eleanor. He hadn't expected Rose to read it. He had written it for whoever eventually solved the mystery. "Open it," Helen whispered. David looked toward Rose. "I think you should decide." She smiled sadly. "My promise ended the moment the key was found." She gently nodded. "Read it." David unfolded the fragile paper one crease at a time. The handwriting inside was remarkably neat, confident, steady. The handwriting of a young man who believed every word mattered. He cleared his throat before reading aloud. "If you are reading this, then something happened to my letter." No one moved. No one even blinked. David continued. "I pray that I am wrong. But if I am right, please understand that I did everything I could." Helen slowly sat down. David's voice had begun to tremble. "The letter I mailed today contains the truth. If Eleanor receives it, this key will never be needed. But if she does not, then someone has made certain she never learns what happened." My heart pounded. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Thomas had written those words before disappearing, long before anyone knew he would never return. How could he possibly have predicted that his letter might never arrive? David continued reading. "I cannot explain everything here. There is not enough time. And this note must remain hidden. If events unfold as I fear, the key belongs to Rose. She alone knows where it must stay." Rose quietly covered her mouth with one trembling hand. "I had no idea," she whispered. "I never knew he left this." David read on. "The key opens something that should remain untouched, unless Eleanor never receives my final letter." Helen frowned. "So the key actually opens something." Apparently it did. David's eyes never left the page. "If that day comes, ask Captain Monroe why." The sentence struck us like lightning. No one spoke. David read it again, slower. "If that day comes, ask Captain Monroe why." I looked immediately toward Helen. She looked at me, then toward Rose, then back at David. Thomas hadn't written, "Find Captain Monroe," or "Trust Captain Monroe." He had written something entirely different. "Ask him why. Not where. Not how. Why." As though Thomas already knew exactly who would be responsible if the letter disappeared. David lowered the page. "I don't understand." Rose closed her eyes. "I think he did." Helen stood abruptly. "We need every record we have on Monroe." David nodded. "Every interview. Every military report. Every photograph." I interrupted gently. "Helen." She looked toward me. "You told us Captain Monroe died years ago." "I did. So we can't ask him anything." Silence followed. The realization settled over all of us. The one man Thomas had pointed toward had already taken every answer he possessed to his grave. Rose suddenly spoke. "Maybe not." Everyone turned toward her. "What do you mean?" She smiled faintly. "When my husband retired from the post office, Captain Monroe attended the ceremony." David frowned. "He lived in Ashford." "No, but close enough. I remember because he apologized." The room froze. "He apologized." Rose nodded slowly. "He came over after the ceremony. He recognized me immediately. We spoke for perhaps 2 minutes." "What did he say?" Rose looked out the bedroom window. "I never understood it at the time. But now." She took a slow breath. "Perhaps I do." David leaned closer. "What exactly did he say?" Rose repeated the words exactly as she remembered them. "Mrs. Bennet, there are mistakes a man can never repair. I hope one day someone forgives mine." The silence that followed seemed endless. Helen whispered almost to herself. "He knew." David nodded. "He absolutely knew." I looked again at the handwritten note. At Thomas's unmistakable signature. at the sentence directing us toward Monroe. For the first time since discovering the envelope, the mystery no longer felt accidental. This was not simply a lost letter. Someone had interfered. Someone had made a choice. Someone had lived with that choice for the rest of his life. David carefully folded the note exactly as Thomas had left it. Then he looked at the tiny silver key resting beside it. "So," he said quietly, "the question isn't whether this key opens something. It does. The real question," he slowly turned the key over in his palm, "is what Thomas believed was so important, that he trusted no one except Rose to protect it." That exact moment, Susan, who had remained quietly standing near the bedroom door, suddenly frowned. She looked toward the old cedar chest, then toward the key, then back again. "I've just remembered something." Everyone looked at her. "When my father was still alive," she said slowly, "he once told me this wasn't the only thing Thomas built before leaving for the war." Susan's words lingered in the bedroom long after she had spoken them. No one rushed to answer. After everything we had uncovered during the past few hours, we had all learned the same lesson. The smallest detail often became the most important. David broke the silence first. "What do you mean this wasn't the only thing Thomas built?" Susan rested one hand on the edge of the cedar chest, thinking carefully before answering. "My father wasn't interested in history. He rarely spoke about the war. But every now and then, he'd tell stories about growing up with Uncle Thomas." She smiled faintly. "He always said Thomas couldn't stop building things. Birdhouses, bookshelves, clocks, toy wagons. If wood could be cut, Thomas could turn it into something useful." Rose nodded. "That's true. He never liked sitting still." Susan continued. "One evening, Dad mentioned something strange. He said Uncle Thomas spent nearly 3 months working on one project that no one in the family was allowed to see." Helen immediately leaned forward. "What project?" "He didn't know. Thomas kept it locked inside his father's workshop." David frowned. "My grandfather's workshop?" Susan nodded. "The old one behind the Whitmore house." David looked genuinely surprised. "That building is still standing." "It is." "Yes. Barely." He smiled. "It's been used for storage for decades. I haven't stepped inside since cleaning it after Dad passed away." Rose slowly looked toward him. "Did you ever remove Thomas's workbench?" David thought for a moment. "No. I couldn't bring myself to. So it's still there. Exactly where he left it." Rose closed her eyes. A peaceful smile crossed her face. "I hoped you'd say that." David looked confused. "You think whatever he built is still inside?" "I don't know. But Thomas hated leaving projects unfinished." She looked directly at him. "If he spent months building something, he wouldn't have destroyed it before leaving." The possibility settled over us. Another place. Another hidden clue. Perhaps another answer. Helen carefully placed Thomas's handwritten note back inside the cloth pouch with the silver key. "We're not separating these." "No," David agreed. "They've stayed together for 78 years. They stay together now." I looked toward the bedroom window. Dark clouds had begun gathering again. The afternoon light was fading much faster than before. A summer storm was moving across the valley. "We should probably head back." Helen glanced outside. "If we're going to the workshop, I'd rather do it before that rain reaches us." David nodded. "It's only 5 minutes away." Susan gently closed the cedar chest. The old lock clicked shut with a sound that echoed strangely through the room, almost like a chapter ending. Rose rested one hand against the polished wood. "Thank you." She whispered the words so quietly that I wasn't sure whether she was speaking to us, or to Thomas. As we made our way downstairs, I found myself studying the photographs hanging along the staircase. One picture caught my attention. A family gathered around a Christmas tree sometime in the early 1950s. Children smiling, parents laughing, grandparents seated proudly in the center. Life continuing, ordinary, beautiful. Yet one chair remained empty. Not physically, emotionally. Couldn't explain why. It simply felt as though someone was missing from the photograph. David noticed where I was looking. My grandmother never allowed anyone to sit there. Why? It had been Thomas's chair before the war. I stared at the picture a little longer. Even years later. Even 40 years later. He smiled sadly. Family traditions don't always make sense. Sometimes. They're just another way people keep loving someone. Outside, the wind had grown stronger. Leaves danced across the front yard. Thunder rolled somewhere beyond the hills. We climbed back into David's truck. This time no one spoke during the drive. Every person seemed lost inside private thoughts. Mine kept returning to Thomas's note. If the letter never arrives, ask Captain Monroe why. It no longer sounded like an accusation. Sounded like certainty. As though Thomas had already understood something the rest of us still couldn't see. The Whitmore family property stood on the edge of town. A weathered farmhouse overlooked wide fields that stretched toward the horizon. Behind it, partially hidden by towering oak trees, stood an old wooden workshop. Time had not been kind to it. Several roof shingles were missing. One window had been boarded shut. Paint peeled from nearly every wall. Yet the building remained standing. Proud, stubborn, almost refusing to surrender to age. David parked the truck. My grandfather built this in 1918. He smiled. My father always said Thomas loved this place more than the house. We stepped carefully across damp grass. The heavy wooden door resisted at first, then opened with a deep groan. The familiar scent of old timber, machine oil, and sawdust drifted into the cool afternoon air. I had visited enough historic buildings to recognize it instantly. Some workshops never truly lose the smell of work. Dust covered almost everything. Shelves lined the walls. Rusting hand tools still hung from nails. A hand-operated drill press stood in one corner. Wooden planes, hammers, measuring squares. Everything appeared frozen in another era. David walked directly toward a sturdy oak workbench positioned beneath the far window. There. He brushed away a thick layer of dust. My father refused to move it. The surface was covered with old scratches, small burn marks, hundreds of tiny cuts left by decades of careful craftsmanship. Rose smiled. I remember this bench. Thomas built his first toy boat here. Helen slowly examined the surrounding shelves. There are dozens of unfinished pieces. David nodded. He was always making something. I wandered quietly around the room. Most objects looked exactly as one would expect. Boxes of nails. Glass jars filled with screws. Wood scraps stacked neatly by size. Then something unusual caught my eye. Above the workbench hung an old wooden clock. Its hands had stopped. 3:47. Unlike everything else in the workshop, it wasn't covered in dust. Only a very thin layer rested across its surface. I frowned. David. He turned. When was the last time someone touched this clock? He looked up. I honestly don't know. Years. Maybe decades. I stepped closer. It doesn't look like decades. Everyone gathered around. The clock itself was beautifully crafted. Solid walnut. Hand-carved numbers. No manufacturer's name anywhere. Only one small inscription burned into the wood. T.W. Thomas Whitmore. Rose smiled immediately. He made that during high school. David nodded. I forgot all about it. Then Helen tilted her head slightly. That's strange. What is? She pointed toward the motionless hands. They're stopped. So? She looked at David. Didn't you say Thomas repaired clocks? He loved them. Helen folded her arms. Then why would he leave his own clock broken? The room fell silent. No one answered. 'Cause suddenly, It no longer looked like a broken clock at all. It looked intentional. No one spoke. The old clock hung quietly above Thomas Whitmore's workbench, its wooden case glowing softly beneath the grey afternoon light filtering through the workshop window. 3:47. The hands had stopped at exactly the same position decades earlier. Or had they? Helen stepped closer. "May I?" David nodded. "Go ahead." She removed a clean cotton handkerchief from her purse and gently brushed away the remaining dust covering the face of the clock. Immediately another detail appeared. There wasn't a single crack in the glass. No broken gears were visible. No warped wood. Nothing suggested the clock had failed naturally. "It almost looks," Helen whispered, "as if someone stopped it on purpose." David folded his arms. "My father tried to wind it once. Everyone looked at him. When? I was probably 15. What happened? He said it wouldn't move. The winding key fit perfectly. But nothing happened. So he assumed the mechanism had rusted." Rose slowly shook her head. "Thomas built that clock. I know. He would never allow a clock to seize from neglect." David looked back at the motionless hands. "I suppose not." I stepped closer. For years I had enjoyed restoring old household items with my husband. Nothing complicated. A loose cabinet hinge. A squeaky rocking chair. An old radio. You learn to notice tiny imperfections after enough years. Something about this clock bothered me. Not the hands. The numbers. Specifically, the number 3. It appeared slightly darker than the others. Almost as though countless fingers had touched that exact spot over many years. "Helen!" She followed my gaze. "I see it." David frowned. "What?" "The wood." I pointed carefully. "Look around the number 3. He leaned closer. Then his eyebrows lifted. "I never noticed that." The finish surrounding the carved numeral had worn differently from every other number on the dial. Not dramatically. Just enough. As though someone had pressed there many times. Rose smiled unexpectedly. "Oh," she whispered. "I remember." David turned immediately. "You do." She nodded. "When Thomas finished building it, he kept showing everyone a little trick." "What kind of trick?" She laughed softly. "He wouldn't tell us. He'd simply press something and smile when we couldn't figure it out." David stared at the clock. "You think there's a hidden mechanism?" Rose shrugged. "It wouldn't surprise me. Thomas had already built a cedar chest with a false bottom. Concealed compartment. Hidden key. Why not a hidden clock?" David carefully reached toward the face. "Be gentle," Helen reminded him. "I will." He pressed lightly beside the carved number 3. Nothing happened. He tried again. Still nothing. Rose frowned. "No. It wasn't there. I remember his thumb being higher." David moved his hand slightly upward. Another gentle press. A faint click echoed inside the wooden case. Every person in the workshop froze. "I heard that," Helen whispered. "So did I." David carefully removed his hand. The clock remained motionless. Nothing else happened. He pressed again. Click. Exactly the same sound. "It isn't broken," he murmured. "It's locked." He turned the clock slightly sideways. There, almost invisible beneath years of varnish, was a narrow seam running around the back panel. Felt my pulse quicken. "It opens." David nodded. "I think you're right." He carefully lifted the clock from the wall. It was heavier than expected. Solid walnut. Beautifully balanced. He placed it gently on the workbench. Rose smiled to herself. Thomas always hated obvious hiding places. Helen examined the rear panel. There must be another release. The 4 of us searched quietly. No screws. No hinges. No visible latch. Then Susan noticed something. The winding hole. "What about it?" She pointed toward the small brass opening where the clock key would normally fit. "It isn't centered." She was right. The winding hole sat slightly lower than normal. only by a fraction. Enough to escape casual attention. David slowly picked up an old brass winding key lying inside a nearby drawer. I think this belongs to it. He inserted the key. Instead of winding clockwise, he turned it gently to the left. Another click, louder this time. The rear panel shifted outward less than an inch. No one moved. David looked toward Rose. I think Thomas wanted you to see this. She smiled. No. She looked at me. I think he wanted history to see it. With extraordinary care, David opened the hidden compartment. It was surprisingly shallow, only large enough to hold a few papers. Inside rested a single leather notebook. Dark brown. No title. No decoration. Just initials embossed into the cover. QW. Helen's breathing caught. A journal. David carefully lifted it out. Dust had never touched it. The leather remained soft despite its age. Thomas had protected it perfectly. He opened the first page. Written neatly across the top were the words, "Private journal. To be destroyed if I return home." Every one of us exchanged stunned glances. "If I return home," I repeated quietly. Rose nodded. He expected to survive. At least when he wrote that. David slowly turned the page. The first dated entry began several months before Thomas disappeared. He read the opening sentence aloud. If anyone other than me is reading this, then the truth was too dangerous to stay buried. No one spoke. The workshop suddenly felt colder. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley. Rain began striking the old roof in steady waves. It sounded as though the entire world had decided to remain outside. While we uncovered secrets that had waited nearly 8 decades to be told, David looked down at the journal once more. There are dozens of entries. Helen nodded slowly. We don't read them here. No, he agreed. Not standing in an old workshop. Rose smiled gently. Some stories deserve the same respect they waited 80 years to receive. David carefully closed the leather journal. As he did, a folded photograph slipped silently from between its pages, landing face down on Thomas Whitmore's workbench. The photograph landed softly on the oak workbench, face down. No one reached for it. Not because we weren't curious. Because by then, we had all begun to understand that every object Thomas Whitmore had left behind deserved patience. David carefully placed the journal beside the cloth pouch containing the silver key before slowly picking up the photograph. He turned it over. For a moment, he simply stared. Then the color drained from his face. Helen noticed immediately. What is it? David didn't answer. Instead, he silently handed the photograph to her. She looked down. Her lips parted slightly. Oh, she whispered. This can't be right. I stepped closer. May I? Helen nodded without taking her eyes off the image. The photograph was remarkably clear. Far clearer than most wartime pictures I'd ever seen. It showed 5 people standing outside what appeared to be a military administration building somewhere in Europe. Thomas stood near the center. He wasn't smiling. Neither was anyone else. To his left stood Captain James Richard Monroe. I recognized him instantly from the earlier photograph David had shown us. But it wasn't Monroe who caught my attention. It was the third man. An older civilian wearing a dark overcoat. No military insignia. No uniform. No identifying marks. Yet every soldier in the photograph seemed to be looking toward him instead of the camera. Almost as though he had been the most important person present. On the back of the photograph, Thomas had written only one sentence. The man who changed everything. Nothing else. No name. No date. No explanation. David slowly rubbed the back of his neck. My father never mentioned this picture. Helen turned it over again. The paper matches the journal. So Thomas hid it himself. Rose adjusted her glasses. Let me see. David carefully knelt beside her wheelchair and placed the photograph in her hands. She studied it quietly. 1 minute. Then another. Suddenly, her expression changed. I know him. Every head turned toward her. David looked stunned. You do? She nodded slowly. I've never forgotten that face. Who is he? Rose frowned. I don't know his name. But I saw him once. When? The week before Thomas left. The room became silent once again. Rose kept looking at the photograph as though it were opening a door inside her memory. Eleanor and I had gone to the train station. There was a black government car parked outside. Very unusual for our town. She pointed toward the civilian. He stepped out of that car. David frowned. He came to Ashford. I believe so. He spoke privately with Thomas. For how long? Only a few minutes. Did you hear anything? No. But I remember Thomas afterward. What about him? He wasn't frightened. He paused. He looked disappointed. That choice of words surprised all of us. Disappointed. Not scared. Not angry. Not confused. Disappointed. Helen looked thoughtfully toward the journal. Perhaps whatever happened began before Thomas ever left for Europe. David nodded slowly. Maybe. I looked again at the mysterious civilian. Everything about him felt ordinary. Gray overcoat, dark hat, leather gloves. He could have been a banker, lawyer, teacher. Nothing suggested power. And yet Thomas had written, "The man who changed everything." Susan suddenly spoke. My father used to mention someone. Everyone looked toward her. Who? I don't remember the name. But whenever Uncle Thomas came home on leave, he'd disappear into Grandpa's workshop after receiving letters from Washington. David frowned. Washington. She nodded. Dad always thought Uncle Thomas was helping with some military paperwork. Helen folded her arms. That doesn't fit. What do you mean? Thomas was a sergeant. He wouldn't normally receive personal correspondence from Washington. David looked at the photograph again. Unless. He stopped speaking. Unless what? Yes. He took a slow breath. Unless someone in Washington already knew who he was. No one answered. The idea sounded impossible. Somehow, everything we had uncovered seemed to point toward the same conclusion. Thomas hadn't simply become involved in something unexpected during the war. Whatever burden he carried had started before he disappeared. Rain hammered against the workshop roof. The old building creaked softly with every gust of wind. David opened the journal once more. This photograph wasn't marking today's page. What do you mean? Helen asked. It fell from somewhere near the middle. He carefully counted several entries before finding where the photograph had originally rested. The date at the top of the page read, September 18, 1945. Nearly 2 months before the letter had been mailed. David looked toward us. I think this is where the Raoul story begins. He started reading. Today Captain Monroe introduced me to a man whose name I will never write. He told me forgetting that name might one day save someone's life. The room seemed to grow colder. David continued. He offered me a choice. I said no. He smiled. And then he told me, "You don't understand yet." David stopped reading. No one asked him to continue. Not because we didn't want to know. Because every sentence seemed heavier than the last. Helen looked toward the rain-covered window. I've spent 30 years preserving history, she whispered. I've learned something. What? Yes. The biggest secrets almost never begin with villains. They begin with ordinary people who believe they're doing the right thing. David slowly closed the journal again. We're not reading another word today. Rose looked surprised. Why not? Because we're tired. He smiled gently. And because once we start, there's no turning back. He carefully placed the journal inside the document case beside the unopened envelope. A letter. Key. Thomas's hidden note. The photograph. The journal. 5 separate pieces. 5 fragments of one unfinished story. As David snapped the case shut, a faint metallic sound echoed from inside. Teeny, dark, almost unnoticed. Rose looked up immediately. That wasn't the key. David frowned. What? Listen. He gently shook the case again. The same metallic click answered from somewhere beneath the journal. Helen's eyes widened. There shouldn't be anything else in there. David slowly reopened the case, carefully lifted the journal, then froze. Hidden beneath the leather cover, pressed flat against the bottom, lay a second key, molar, made of brass, and tied to it, with a piece of faded string, was a tiny paper tag. On it, in Thomas Whitmore's unmistakable handwriting, were 4 simple words. For the safety deposit box. No one spoke. The tiny brass key rested in David's palm, catching the dim afternoon light that filtered through the dusty workshop window. Compared to the silver key, it seemed almost insignificant. Molar. Lighter. Ordinary. But after everything we had uncovered, none of us believed in ordinary anymore. Helen adjusted her glasses and leaned closer. The tag. David carefully turned it over. There was nothing written on the back. Only 4 words on the front. For the safety deposit box. Rose slowly exhaled. So there was another secret. David nodded almost absent-mindedly. It appears there was. I couldn't take my eyes off the tiny key. Did Thomas ever own a safety deposit box? David frowned. Not that I know of. He was 23. He didn't own property. He barely had any money. Helen crossed her arms. Which makes this even stranger. Why? Asked. Because young soldiers didn't usually rent safety deposit boxes. They used family homes. Or banks through their parents. This, she looked toward the key, suggests he expected to leave something behind. David carefully examined the brass tag. There were tiny scratches around the hole where the string passed through, as though another key had once hung beside it. But not anymore, he murmured. What? Susan asked. I think there used to be 2. He pointed toward the worn metal ring. See these marks? Something larger rubbed against it for years. Helen nodded. I believe you're right. So where's the other key? No one answered. Rain continued drumming steadily against the workshop roof. The sound had become almost hypnotic. David carefully placed both keys side by side on the workbench. The silver one, the brass one. Neither resembled modern keys. Both were handmade. Thomas had clearly chosen them carefully. Rose suddenly smiled. I remember something. Every head turned toward her. It isn't much. Sometimes that's enough, Helen said. Rose pointed toward the brass key. When Thomas was a little boy, he hated banks. David laughed softly. I've never heard anyone hate banks. He didn't hate money, Rose clarified. He hated locks. What do you mean? He used to say, if someone builds a lock, someone else can open it. David looked thoughtfully toward the workshop shelves. That sounds exactly like him. He spent one entire summer making wooden puzzle boxes. Rose continued. People thought they were impossible to open. But Thomas always smiled. Because he knew the answer. I looked again toward the hidden compartment inside the clock. Then toward the false bottom of the cedar chest. Then toward the brass key. He enjoyed hiding things. Rose nodded. No. He enjoyed making people think. That distinction felt important. Thomas wasn't secretive for the sake of mystery. Everything he built seemed designed to reward patience. To force people to observe. To slow down. Helen carefully picked up the handwritten note Thomas had left inside the pouch. She read it again silently. Then suddenly frowned. I missed something. David looked up. What? She pointed to one sentence. The key opens something. Unless Eleanor never receives my final letter. She looked around the room. He never said. Which key? Silence. Every one of us looked toward the 2 keys lying on the workbench. Until that moment, we had simply assumed Thomas referred to the silver key. But now, that assumption no longer seemed certain. David carefully reread the note. "You're right. He only says, the key. Singular. Not silver. Not brass." Rose smiled knowingly. Thomas loved sentences with 2 meanings. Susan looked confused. Then which key was he talking about? Rose answered honestly. "I have no idea. But I suspect." He expected someone to ask exactly that question. David chuckled quietly. "I think Uncle Thomas would have made an excellent detective." Helen smiled. "Or an impossible one." The tension eased for the first time in hours. Only briefly, because another realization quickly followed. "We still don't know where the safety deposit box is," said. David nodded. "Exactly. A key without a bank. A lock without a location." Helen suddenly looked toward the journal. "Maybe we do." She carefully opened the leather notebook once again. Instead of reading from the beginning, she flipped through every page slowly. Not reading. Looking. Searching. Thomas had been a craftsman. A man who loved details. If he'd left clues before, perhaps he'd left another. Page after page passed beneath her fingers. She stopped. "I found something." David stepped closer. The page appeared almost blank. First. Then Helen tilted it toward the window. A faint pencil sketch became visible beneath the ink. It wasn't writing. It was a map. Rough. Simple. Just a few streets. Church. A railroad line. And a square building marked only with 1 letter. E. David stared for several seconds. Then his eyes widened. "I know this." "You do?" Helen asked. He nodded slowly. "This isn't Europe. It isn't Washington. It isn't the army. So where is it?" David smiled in disbelief. "It's downtown Ashford." He pointed toward the square building. "And the B stands for Benton National Bank." Susan frowned. "That bank closed years ago." "It did," David agreed. "But the building is still standing." Helen looked hopeful. "What is it now?" "A law office occupies the first floor." "And the vault?" David's smile slowly disappeared. "As far as I know, the original safety deposit vault was never removed." Silence filled the workshop again. The brass key. The hand-drawn map. An old bank whose vault might still exist. Everything suddenly aligned. Almost too perfectly. Rose looked toward the rain outside. "It seems Thomas planned farther ahead than any of us imagined." David carefully tore a small bookmark from his notebook and placed it between the journal pages containing the map. Then he closed it gently. "I think tomorrow." He looked at each of us. "We visit Benton National Bank." No one disagreed. As we gathered the journal, the keys, the hidden note, and the unopened envelope back into the document case, I found myself looking one last time around Thomas's workshop. Tools. The unfinished projects. The old clock. The workbench. Everything remained exactly where he had left it. Waiting. Not just for someone to discover what he had hidden, but for someone willing to finish what he had started. And somewhere beneath the streets of Ashford, inside a vault that had survived nearly 8 decades, another piece of Thomas Whitmore's story was still waiting for us. That night I barely slept. The journal. 2 keys. The hidden map. The unopened letter. Every discovery seemed to answer one question while creating 3 new ones. Most of all, I couldn't stop thinking about Thomas. He had been only 23 years old. Yet he had prepared for the possibility that his final letter would never reach the woman he loved. That wasn't fear. It was certainty. And certainty like that doesn't appear without a reason. Just after sunrise, I returned to the museum. David's truck was already parked outside. Helen had unlocked the front doors early. When I stepped inside, I found both of them standing around a large wooden table. The document case rested in the center. Neither had opened it. We agreed we'd wait for you, Helen said. Smiled. I appreciate that. David poured 3 cups of coffee from an old metal thermos. I have a feeling today is going to answer at least one question. And probably create several more. I replied. He laughed. That's becoming a habit. Before leaving, Helen carefully removed the brass key from the pouch. She wrapped it in soft archival paper. If this really belongs to the old bank, I don't want 80 years of history scratching against modern metal. David nodded approvingly. My uncle would have appreciated that. Ashford looked brighter after the previous day's storm. Rain had washed every rooftop. The streets shimmered beneath the morning sun. People waved as David drove through town. Several recognized Helen. A few noticed the document case resting carefully between us. None of them knew the story unfolding around it. The Benton National Bank building stood only 4 blocks from the courthouse. Although the bank had closed decades earlier, the stone facade remained almost untouched. Tall columns framed the entrance. Bronze doors reflected the morning light. Above them, the old name had been carved permanently into the limestone. Benton National Bank. A brass plaque beside the entrance identified the current occupants. Carter and Ellis attorneys at law. David Park. For a moment none of us got out. So, Helen finally said, either this key opens nothing, or we're about to step into another part of Thomas's life. David picked up the document case. I've waited my whole life to know who my uncle really was. His voice was calm, but I noticed his hands. They trembled ever so slightly. Inside, the building had changed remarkably little. Marble floors, high ceilings, dark oak walls. Only the teller counters had disappeared. A young receptionist welcomed us politely. Good morning. Helen smiled. We're hoping to speak with someone about the old bank vault. The receptionist looked puzzled. The vault? Yes. It may involve a safety deposit box dating back to the 1940s. The young woman blinked twice. I've never been asked that before. I'm not surprised. David replied gently. She disappeared into a hallway. A few minutes later, an older man wearing glasses emerged from one of the offices. I'm Charles Ellis. He shook each of our hands politely. I understand you're asking about the original vault. David carefully explained everything. Not every detail. Only enough. The unopened letter. The hidden map. The brass key. Mr. Ellis listened without interrupting. When David finished, the attorney stood silently for several moments. Then he smiled. I think you're all going to find this interesting. He motioned for us to follow him. We walked down a narrow corridor toward the rear of the building. At its end stood an enormous circular steel vault door. It looked almost untouched since the 1930s. The vault remains exactly where the bank left it. Mr. Ellis explained. We converted most of the old deposit boxes into document storage. But several hundred boxes were never claimed. David looked at him. You still have them? Legally, yes. The contents belong to the state until ownership can be established. Helen exchanged a glance with me. The key suddenly felt much heavier inside her purse. Mr. Ellis unlocked the massive vault. The thick steel door swung open with surprising ease. Cool air drifted outward. Rows upon rows of small brass deposit boxes lined every wall. Hundreds of them. Perhaps thousands. Each carried a tiny engraved number. The room fell silent. Some boxes had clearly been opened recently. Others looked as though no human hand had touched them for decades. Mr. Ellis folded his arms. Now comes the difficult part. David frowned. The number. Exactly. The key is useless unless we know which box it belongs to. For a moment, disappointment settled over us. Thomas had left the key. The map. Everything except the one detail we needed. The box number. Helen slowly opened the journal once more. There has to be another clue. She carefully turned each page. Nothing. David examined the brass key under the vault lights. There aren't any numbers engraved. Only the manufacturer's mark. Nothing more. I walked slowly along the rows of deposit boxes. Hundreds of tiny doors stared back at me. One of them, just one, had waited nearly 80 years for that key. Then something caught my eye. Near the bottom corner of one column, a single deposit box looked different. Not newer, older. Its brass had darkened much more than the surrounding boxes. Almost as though someone had touched it countless times long ago. Without thinking, I knelt. Helen noticed. "What is it?" "I don't know." I gently brushed away a thin layer of dust. Almost invisible beneath decades of tarnish. Someone had scratched 3 tiny letters into the metal. Captain James Richard Monroe's initials. The same initials we had found on the envelope. The same initials on the military report. The same initials Thomas had pointed us toward. David slowly knelt beside me. His breathing had become noticeably faster. He reached into Helen's hand, carefully accepted the small brass key, then looked at the number engraved above the deposit box. 347. For a brief second, none of us understood why that number felt so familiar. Then all at once, we remembered. Back in Thomas's workshop, the wooden clock, the hands had stopped forever at exactly 3:47. For several long seconds, no one moved. Box 347. The number seemed almost unreal. I looked at David. He looked at Helen. Neither of us had spoken, yet we were all thinking the same thing. The clock. 3:47. Thomas hadn't left the hands frozen at a random hour. He had left an address. Not a time. Number. Destination. Helen slowly exhaled. "My goodness." She whispered it almost to herself. The clock wasn't broken. David smiled for the first time that morning. No. It was pointing. Mr. Ellis looked from one face to another, completely lost. "I'm afraid I'm missing something." David turned toward him. "My uncle built a clock before leaving for the war. And it stopped at 3:47. Mr. Ellis frowned. "You think he did that intentionally?" David looked back at the deposit box. "I don't think. I know." The attorney remained silent. Perhaps he didn't fully understand. But even he could see that 80 years of scattered clues had just aligned into a single unmistakable answer. Helen carefully handed David the brass key. "I think," she said softly, "this belongs to you." David didn't answer immediately. He simply stared at the tiny key resting in his palm. "My father spent 60 years wondering what happened to his brother." He swallowed hard. "I wish he could have been here." Rose's words from the previous day returned to my mind. Some stories wait for the people who are ready to hear them. Perhaps this was one of them. David slowly inserted the brass key into the lock. Fit perfectly. No force. No hesitation. As though it had never belonged anywhere else. He looked toward Mr. Ellis. "May I?" The attorney nodded. "As the temporary legal custodian, I can authorize opening an unclaimed box in my presence." He paused. "Especially one that appears connected to an unresolved historical matter." David wrapped his fingers around the key. Then stopped. His hand was trembling. Helen gently rested one hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to rush." He smiled faintly. "I've waited my entire life. I can wait another 10 seconds. He counted them silently. 1, 2, 3. He turned the key. A soft metallic click echoed inside the vault. Unlike every other sound we had heard over the past 2 days, this one carried finality. The lock had not resisted. It had simply accepted. David pulled gently on the small brass handle. The narrow deposit drawer slid outward. Slowly, almost reluctantly, cool air escaped from inside. The compartment was deeper than I expected. Nearly 2 feet long. Dark. Icy. Untouched. Helen switched on the flashlight from her phone. Its beam illuminated the contents. There were no stacks of money. No gold. No jewelry. Only 3 objects. Small wooden box. A sealed manila envelope. And a leather-bound folder tied with faded blue ribbon. David carefully removed all 3 items and placed them on a nearby inspection table inside the vault. No one spoke. The silence had become almost ceremonial. Mr. Ellis adjusted his glasses. I've opened hundreds of abandoned deposit boxes, he admitted quietly. I've never seen one left exactly like this. The wooden box was beautifully made. Walnut. Handcrafted. The joints were identical to those on the cedar chest. Thomas had built it. There was no doubt. Its lid carried only one burned inscription. W. Eleanor Whitman. Helen whispered. David nodded. He made this for her. Rose had been right. He had practiced on her cedar chest first, then built the real one. The box she was supposed to receive after the wedding. She never did. Helen gently touched the lid. It isn't locked. David slowly opened it. Inside rested a velvet cloth. Nothing more. He lifted the cloth carefully. Beneath it lay a simple engagement ring. White gold. Small diamond. Elegant. Aimless. Rose closed her eyes. She never wore that ring. She whispered. No. David replied softly. She never even saw it. The realization struck every one of us. Thomas had planned to propose properly after coming home. The ring inside the museum photograph had only been temporary. Had been forever. Helen quietly wiped away tears. So much hope, she whispered. Hidden inside one little box. David gently closed it again. No one wanted to linger there. Not yet. The second object waited. The manila envelope. Unlike the letter still resting safely inside the document case, this envelope had never entered the mail. Across the front, Thomas had written, "To Captain James Richard Monroe. Deliver only if necessary." David looked at Helen. Necessary. Helen repeated the word. He expected Monroe to receive this, but only under certain circumstances. Mr. Ellis frowned. Which means he trusted Monroe. Finished. David slowly shook his head. I don't think that's quite right. What do you mean? He trusted Monroe. He looked toward the unopened letter. Until something changed. The final object remained untouched. The leather folder. Blue ribbon still tied exactly as Thomas had left it. Unlike everything else. Carried no name. No initials. No instructions. Only one date embossed into the lower corner. October 31st, 1945. Just days before the letter had been mailed. Helen looked at David. I have a feeling. Whatever is inside that folder will explain everything. David carefully reached for the ribbon. His fingers paused just before touching it. From somewhere behind us, a familiar voice echoed through the vault. Don't open that first. Every one of us turned. Standing in the entrance of the vault, breathing heavily from having hurried downstairs, was Rose Bennett. She looked directly at the leather folder, then at David, and with surprising certainty, he said, Thomas told me that if anyone ever found all 3, the letter must always be opened first. Every head turned toward Rose. No one had heard her enter. The nurse who had brought her to the museum that morning stood quietly behind the massive vault door, slightly out of breath. Apparently, Rose had insisted on coming downstairs the moment she learned we had found the safety deposit box. She looked exhausted, but her eyes carried the same certainty they had shown since the beginning. David immediately walked toward her. You should be resting. Rose smiled. I've been resting for 98 years. She looked past him toward the inspection table. I wasn't about to miss this. Helen gently helped her closer. The vault was cool, almost cold, but Rose didn't seem to notice. Her attention remained fixed on the 3 objects resting beneath the bright inspection lamp. The engagement ring. The envelope addressed to Captain Monroe. The leather folder. And, inside the document case beside them, the unopened letter. Rose stopped beside the table. "I remember," she whispered. "What do you remember?" David asked. "The last conversation I ever had with Thomas." None of us interrupted. She took a slow breath. "It wasn't at the train station. It was 2 days later." Helen frowned. "I thought you said the station was the last time." "I always believed it was," Rose answered quietly. "But seeing these things has brought something back." She closed her eyes. "He came to my father's grocery store. It was almost closing time. He looked tired. He hadn't shaved. But he smiled the moment he saw me." David listened without blinking. "He asked whether Eleanor had received his first letter. I told him she had. He looked relieved. Then he asked me something strange." "What?" "Yes." "He said, if another letter ever arrives after I'm gone, promise me no one opens anything else first." The room became perfectly silent. David slowly looked toward the unopened envelope inside the document case. "He specifically mentioned the letter." Rose nodded. "Twice. I asked him why. He wouldn't answer. He simply smiled. That same sad smile. The one soldiers wore when they wanted the people they loved to stop asking questions." Helen gently touched the document case. "He knew," she whispered. "He absolutely knew." David carefully removed the envelope from its protective sleeve. The paper looked even older beneath the vault lights. Its edges were fragile. Its faded ink seemed almost translucent. 78 years. The words inside had waited through nearly 8 decades of silence. Rose looked at David. "Your family. You should open it." David immediately shook his head. "No." He turned toward me. "Margaret found it." I looked back at him. I was only the messenger. Helen smiled softly. "Perhaps that's exactly why you should do it together." David looked at me. Neither of us needed to say anything. Some moments don't belong to one person. They belong to everyone who carried the story there. We stood side by side. David carefully slipped a thin archival knife beneath the fragile flap. The wax seal, already weakened by time, separated almost effortlessly. No tearing. No damage. Just the quiet release of something that had waited far too long. For a moment, no one reached inside. It felt almost sacred. Finally, David gently slid the folded pages from the envelope. 3 sheets. Cream-colored. Still remarkably well preserved. The handwriting was beautiful. Dark blue ink. Every line perfectly straight. Thomas had clearly taken his time. David looked toward Rose. She nodded. "Read." His voice was barely above a whisper as he began. "My dearest Eleanor." Rose closed her eyes. Helen lowered her head. Even Mr. Ellis quietly removed his glasses. David continued. "If these words are in your hands, then I have been blessed beyond anything I deserve. I imagine you're smiling. And I hope you're laughing at how long my handwriting still takes to read." A gentle smile appeared across Rose's face. "That sounds like him," she whispered. David kept reading. "I promised I would never lie to you. I intend to keep that promise. So before I come home, there is something you deserve to know." The room grew still again. I expected a confession. Perhaps news of an injury. Perhaps fear. Is it? The next sentence surprised every one of us. "I have been asked to do something that I believe is wrong." David stopped, looked toward Helen, then continued. "I said no. They told me I didn't understand. They told me history would remember heroes, but never the truth." Helen slowly inhaled. The journal. The mysterious civilian. Captain Monroe. Everything was beginning to connect. David read on. "I do not know whether refusing their request places me in danger. I pray it does not. But if anything prevents me from returning, please never believe I abandoned you. I would cross every ocean, every battlefield, every impossible road, to keep my promise. Rose quietly wiped away a tear. So that's why, she whispered. Why what? Helen asked gently. Eleanor. She never believed Thomas had left willingly. David continued reading. If this letter reaches you, burn every paper I ever left behind. The notebook, the keys, the photographs, everything. Because none of it will matter. I'll be home. The sentence echoed through the vault. None of it will matter. I'll be home. David slowly lowered the first page. No one spoke. We all understood something heartbreaking. Thomas had expected the letter to arrive. He had expected to survive. Everything else, the hidden keys, the journal, the safety deposit box, had only existed in case the impossible happened. David unfolded the second page. Just before beginning to read, his eyes suddenly stopped on something written along the bottom margin. Teeny, almost hidden beneath the fold. His expression changed instantly. Helen noticed. What is it? David didn't answer immediately. Is it? He turned the page toward us. There, written in much smaller handwriting than the rest of the letter, appeared one final sentence, clearly added later, not during the original writing, as though Thomas had returned to the letter one last time before sealing it. It read, Monroe was never my enemy. No one breathed. The sentence was so small that it could easily have remained hidden forever. Had David unfolded the page a little less carefully, had the light struck the paper from a different angle, we might never have noticed it. Monroe was never my enemy. Helen was the first to break the silence. That changes everything. David slowly nodded. It certainly changes what we believed. For nearly 3 days, every clue had pointed toward Captain James Richard Monroe. His initials on the envelope. His signature on the investigation report. Thomas's handwritten note telling us to ask him why. Rose's memory of Monroe apologizing decades later. Every road seemed to lead to the same man. No. Thomas himself was telling us something entirely different. Monroe was never my enemy. David carefully read the sentence again, almost as if hoping another meaning might appear. Didn't. The words were unmistakable. Rose slowly smiled. I wondered. You wondered what? Yes. The apology. Everyone looked at her. When Monroe spoke to me all those years ago, he didn't sound like a guilty man. He sounded like a broken one. Helen frowned thoughtfully. There's a difference. A very important difference. David leaned against the inspection table. If Monroe wasn't responsible, then who was? No one answered. Instead, David returned to the second page of the letter. I think Thomas already knew we'd ask that question. He continued reading. My darling, if you are reading this, then I have failed to protect both you and someone else. I wish I could tell you every name, but writing them would place innocent people in danger. Helen immediately looked up. Innocent people. She repeated the phrase quietly. So he was protecting someone. David nodded without taking his eyes off the page. I believe so. He continued. You may someday hear terrible things about Captain Monroe. If that happens, please remember this. He kept his word. He risked far more than anyone will ever know. The room became perfectly still. Rose whispered almost to herself. He was trying to help. David looked toward the journal lying beside the letter. The journal blamed no one. The note pointed us toward Monroe. But not to accuse him. Helen finished the thought. To understand him. Exactly. For the first time since discovering the envelope, Captain Monroe no longer looked like the villain. He looked like another man carrying an unbearable secret. David resumed reading. There are people who believe truth belongs only to governments. I do not. I believe truth belongs first to the families forced to live without it. Mr. Ellis quietly removed his glasses once again. I've practiced law for 40 years, he said softly. I've read thousands of documents. I've never heard anyone express that more beautifully. David turned another section of the page. The handwriting remained steady, remarkably steady. There wasn't a single sign of panic. Thomas had written like a man completely at peace with his decision. If history remembers me only as another missing soldier, let it. If my silence allows others to return home, then silence is a fair price. Rose lowered her head. He knew, she whispered. He already knew. David stopped reading. What do you mean? He wasn't writing like a frightened young man, she answered. He was writing like someone who had already accepted the ending. None of us could argue. The letter carried no anger, no bitterness, only determination. I found myself thinking about something Helen had said the previous day. The biggest secrets almost never begin with villains. They begin with ordinary people who believe they're doing the right thing. Perhaps both had simply become trapped inside circumstances larger than themselves. David unfolded the final page. I think this is the end. His voice had grown quieter than ever. He began reading. If I come home, we'll laugh about all of this together. I'll burn these papers. We'll grow old. We'll argue over the color of the kitchen walls. You'll complain that I spend too much time fixing clocks. And I'll pretend not to hear you. A faint laugh escaped Rose. That would have happened. She smiled through tears. Eleanor hated clocks. David smiled as well. I suppose Thomas would have repaired them anyway. He absolutely would have, Rose replied. Then David read the final paragraph. If I do not return, please don't spend your life waiting. You deserve laughter. You deserve children. You deserve ordinary mornings. You deserve peace. But if one day, many years from now, someone finally places this letter in your hands, tell them I kept every promise I was allowed to keep. David's voice broke completely. He couldn't continue. The final sentence remained unread. Helen gently rested one hand over his. I've got it, she whispered. David nodded silently. Helen looked down at the last line Thomas Whitmore ever wrote. Then read it aloud. My love never got lost. Only my letter did. Silence. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the air inside the old vault seemed unwilling to disturb that final sentence. After nearly 80 years, Thomas had finally spoken. Somehow, his first concern had never been himself. It had always been Eleanor. David carefully folded the pages back into their original order. Just as he slid them into the envelope, something small drifted onto the inspection table. Tiny, brittle newspaper clipping, hidden between the second and third pages. No one had noticed it before. Across the top, barely visible beneath faded ink, was a headline. Army officer dies in house fire. Confidential files believed destroyed. Asterisk asterisk. And beneath the headline, name, Captain James Richard Monroe. For several long moments, none of us touched the newspaper clipping. It lay on the inspection table like one final voice from another century. Fragile, yellowed, barely held together by age. David carefully picked it up by the edges. It's been folded inside the letter all this time. Helen nodded. Thomas wanted Eleanor to find it. Or, Mr. Ellis added quietly. He wanted her to know where to begin looking. That possibility settled heavily over us. Until now, every clue had pointed backward. Toward the war. Toward Monroe. Toward Thomas. Perhaps this was the first clue pointing forward. David unfolded the clipping. The article was incomplete. The right side had been torn away decades earlier. Only half the story remained. Oh, it was enough. He began reading aloud. Captain James Richard Monroe, formerly attached to Army Intelligence. The room immediately fell silent. Army Intelligence. Not ordinary infantry. Not logistics. Not administration. Army Intelligence. Helen slowly lowered herself into a nearby chair. So that's why. David looked up. Why what? The missing records. The classified documents. The unnamed civilian. It finally fits. She pointed toward the journal. Thomas wasn't caught in an ordinary military assignment. He became involved in something intelligence-related. Rose whispered. And he wanted no part of it. David continued reading. Died yesterday evening after a fire destroyed his residence. No evidence of foul play has been reported. The fire also consumed several personal documents believed to relate to his military service. Mr. Ellis frowned. Believed. Helen noticed the wording immediately. Interesting. Very. Mr. Ellis agreed. They weren't certain. They assumed. David continued. The army declined to comment. That sentence drew everyone's attention. Helen looked at me. That's unusual. Even for old records. Especially for old records. She folded her hands together. If there had been nothing sensitive, they would have simply confirmed the loss. David stared thoughtfully at the clipping. But they didn't. No. They refused. Rose quietly closed her eyes. I don't think Monroe ever stopped protecting someone. No one argued. Everything Thomas had written now pointed toward the same conclusion. Monroe hadn't intercepted the letter because he wanted to hurt Thomas. He had intercepted it because something larger had already begun. Something dangerous enough that even decades later, the army still refused to discuss it. David carefully turned the clipping over. The back contained part of another article. Most of it had faded beyond recognition. Except for one handwritten note in blue ink. Not printed. Written. The handwriting looked different from Thomas's. More angular. More hurried. Helen immediately noticed. That's not your uncle's writing. David nodded. No. He compared it with the journal. Definitely not. There were only 8 words. He read them aloud. I did what I promised. Forgive me. JRM. Silence. Absolute silence. Captain Monroe himself had written it. Not Thomas. Not Eleanor. Monroe. Rose covered her mouth. He sent this. Helen looked surprised. You think he mailed it? No. Rose answered slowly. I think. He hid it. David looked confused. Inside Thomas's letter. She nodded. He wanted Eleanor to know. But he couldn't say it openly. Mr. Ellis considered the possibility. If Monroe intercepted the letter. He also had the opportunity to place something inside. Helen leaned forward. And perhaps remove something. Every person in the room looked toward the 3 handwritten pages. We had been so focused on what remained, that none of us had considered what might be missing. David slowly counted them. 1, 2, 3. He frowned. The page numbers. Helen looked immediately. Each page had been numbered by Thomas himself. 1, 2, 4. The room seemed to stop. There is no page 3. I whispered. David looked again. His face turned pale. There never was. No. Helen corrected gently. There was. She pointed toward the lower corner. Thomas numbered these after writing them. He didn't accidentally skip. Rose slowly looked toward the clipping. Someone removed an entire page. David closed his eyes. Monroe. No. Helen answered quietly. Not necessarily. She pointed toward the handwritten note. If Monroe had removed it, why leave us evidence against himself? The logic was impossible to ignore. Monroe had hidden the clipping. Written an apology. Protected Thomas's words. Nothing about that matched someone trying to erase the truth. Mr. Ellis spoke softly. Perhaps Monroe never removed page 3. The thought settled over all of us. If not Monroe, then who? David carefully returned the clipping to the table. For the first time since opening the letter, we understood something profound. Thomas's final message, the one Eleanor had waited 78 years to receive, was still incomplete. Or, for nearly 8 decades, the missing third page had existed. Or perhaps, still existed. Helen slowly stood. There is only one place left. David looked at her. The envelope addressed to Monroe. She nodded. We've respected Thomas's instructions. We opened the letter first. Now. She gently placed one hand on the sealed manila envelope lying beside the engagement ring. I think it's finally time to discover what Thomas wanted Captain Monroe to know. She carefully turned the envelope over. The wax seal remained perfectly intact. But something immediately caught her attention. Pressed into the wax, almost invisible beneath decades of age, was an unfamiliar emblem. Not the Army, not the Postal Service, not the United States government. A single carved symbol. An owl, holding a key in its claws. The owl seemed to be watching us. It was no larger than a thumbnail, pressed neatly into the dark red wax that had protected the envelope for nearly 8 decades. Its wings were folded. Its eyes were unusually large. And in its claws, held a tiny key. None of us recognized the emblem. Helen adjusted her glasses. I've never seen this before. David slowly shook his head. Neither have I. Mr. Ellis leaned closer. It isn't a military seal. No, Helen agreed. And it certainly isn't a government seal. Rose studied it for several seconds, then quietly whispered, I've seen an owl like that once. Every head turned toward her. You have? David asked. She nodded. Not exactly this one, but something very similar. When? Rose looked toward the ceiling, searching through nearly a century of memories. It was after the war. I must have been 22. Eleanor and I were cleaning out boxes in her parents' attic. David frowned. You never mentioned that. I'd forgotten, she admitted honestly. There was an old envelope. It had an owl pressed into red wax. Helen's expression immediately changed. What happened to it? I don't know. Eleanor became upset. She said Thomas had specifically asked her never to open anything carrying that seal. Silence. Every one of us looked back toward the envelope. Thomas had expected Eleanor to recognize the symbol, which meant this wasn't the first time she'd seen it. David carefully turned the envelope over in his hands. There isn't a return address. No, Helen agreed. And no date. No postmark either. Mr. Ellis added. Meaning it was never mailed. Exactly. Unlike the letter, this envelope had been placed directly into the safety deposit box. Intentionally. David slowly ran one finger along the edge of the wax. It feels untouched. Rose smiled sadly. Because it is. He trusted Monroe, she whispered. But only if this became necessary. I found myself remembering Thomas's words. Deliver only if necessary. Necessary. That word carried much more weight now. Not if I die. Not if I disappear. Necessary. As though Thomas had believed Monroe would know precisely when the moment had arrived. Helen looked toward David. I think. The letter gave us permission. David nodded. So did Rose. He carefully laid the envelope flat on the table. Unlike the first letter, this one was sealed tightly. Its wax had never been disturbed. Mr. Ellis opened a small drawer inside the inspection table and removed a pair of archival gloves. I'd recommend these. David smiled. I think Thomas would appreciate the caution. He slipped the gloves on, then gently examined the wax. There, he pointed. The edge has already begun separating from age. Using the same thin archival blade, he carefully slid beneath the brittle wax. This seal did not crack. It almost dissolved. Time had weakened it so completely that it released without resistance. The flap lifted. There was only one folded sheet. No photographs. No newspaper clippings. No additional pages. Just a single letter. David unfolded it. Immediately his eyebrows rose. It's addressed to Monroe. Helen nodded. Read it. David began. Captain. If you are holding this, then I was right. And you were wrong. Those words struck us immediately. Not with anger, but with certainty. David continued. You told me the truth could wait. I told you it never could. Rose slowly lowered her head. Thomas had not been writing to his superior officer. He had been writing to a friend. Perhaps even to someone he respected deeply. The tone carried disappointment, not resentment. David read on. I know why you stopped my letter. Every person in the vault froze. There it was. The answer. Monroe had stopped it. Thomas already knew. Yet the next sentence overturned everything we thought we understood. I also know. You did it because I asked you to. Silence. Absolute silence. Helen stared at David. Read that again. He did. Word for word. Exactly the same. I know why you stopped my letter. I also know. You did it because I asked you to. Rose slowly closed her eyes. Oh, Thomas, she whispered. David looked completely stunned. He asked Monroe to stop the letter. Mr. Ellis folded his arms. Apparently. But why? No one answered. Because none of us could imagine a reason. Thomas had spent 78 years trying to deliver the letter. Hadn't he? David continued reading. If circumstances changed, you promised me you would destroy it. But if you couldn't, hide it. One day, when the danger had passed, someone honest would finish what we started. Helen slowly sat back in her chair. My goodness, she whispered. It wasn't intercepted. It was protected. The realization spread through the room all at once. The missing letter, the hidden journal, keys, the safety deposit box. None of it had been created to hide the truth forever. It had all been created to preserve the truth, until it became safe. David continued reading. You once asked whether history belongs to governments, or to ordinary people. I still believe the answer is ordinary people. They deserve the truth. But not until the truth can no longer destroy innocent lives. Rose quietly smiled through tears. I understand now. So do I. Helen whispered. David reached the final paragraph. If I return, burn this. If I don't, carry the burden for me. And when the day finally comes, give Eleanor my letter. Then tell the world everything else. David lowered the page. No one spoke. For nearly a full minute. The silence no longer felt heavy. Felt complete. Thomas hadn't failed. Monroe hadn't betrayed him. Together, they had protected something for 78 years. But one mystery still remained. David looked again at the original letter. The missing third page. Helen nodded slowly. If Monroe preserved everything else, then where is it? That exact moment, Mr. Ellis, who had remained quietly studying the inside of the empty envelope, suddenly frowned. He ran one finger along the inner lining, then looked up. This envelope, he said slowly, is thicker than it should be. Everyone immediately looked at Mr. Ellis. What do you mean? David asked. The attorney carefully held the envelope beneath the inspection lamp. I've handled thousands of historical documents. He gently pressed the paper between his fingers. This lining isn't original. Helen stepped closer. You're certain? He nodded. The outer paper and the inner lining were joined together. Professionally. But not by the original manufacturer. Rose looked puzzled. So someone modified the envelope. I believe so. Mr. Ellis answered quietly. After it had already been written. David carefully took the envelope into his own hands. He held it against the light. First, nothing. A faint rectangular shadow appeared between the two layers of paper. His breathing stopped. There is something inside. No one spoke. The room fell silent once again. Helen removed another archival knife from the preservation kit. If we're going to do this, there's only one chance. David nodded. I know. He carefully slid the blade beneath the inner seam. Millimeter by millimeter. The thin layer of paper separated. No tearing. No sudden movements. Only patience. Finally, the hidden compartment opened. Something slid gently onto the inspection table. Folded sheet. Smaller than the others. Perfectly protected. Rose whispered. Oh! David stared at it without moving. The third page. Helen slowly nodded. It has to be. Unlike the first two pages, this one showed no yellowing, no moisture damage, no fading. Being hidden inside the envelope had preserved it almost perfectly. David carefully unfolded it. Across the top, Thomas had written only 3 words. Page 3. Nothing more. No date. No greeting. No signature. Just the missing page. Every one of us instinctively moved closer. David began reading. If you are reading this page. Then Monroe decided the danger had finally passed. The first sentence answered the greatest mystery immediately. Monroe hadn't destroyed it. He had hidden it. Exactly as Thomas had asked. David continued. I asked him to separate these pages. Not because I feared death. But because I feared haste. Haste destroys truth. Helen smiled faintly. That sounds exactly like Thomas. David nodded. He wanted people to understand the story. Before reaching its ending, he continued reading. There are names I will never write. There are places I will never identify. Not because history should forget them, but because innocent families deserve peace. Mr. Ellis quietly folded his hands. Remarkable, he whispered. Even now. He's still protecting people. David continued. What happened after the war will eventually become public. It always does. But when that day comes, please remember this. Most of the men involved believed they were protecting their country. They were not evil. They were afraid. Rose slowly wiped another tear from her cheek. So many young men, trying to do what they believed was right. David turned the page. Near the middle appeared the sentence we had unknowingly been chasing since the beginning. I volunteered. The room froze. David read it again. I volunteered. Helen frowned. For what? David continued. I volunteered to disappear. No one breathed. The sentence echoed inside the vault. I volunteered to disappear. Everything changed. Everything. Thomas had not simply vanished. He had chosen. David's voice trembled. I believed my disappearance would protect several families. Including yours, Eleanor. Rose looked stunned. He chose it, she whispered. He actually chose it. David kept reading. I prayed I would eventually return. I truly believed I would. But if that proved impossible, I asked Monroe to become the guardian of my promises. Helen closed her eyes. So that's why he apologized. She finally understood. He couldn't tell anyone. He had promised Thomas. David nodded slowly. He spent the rest of his life carrying someone else's secret. The final section of the page contained only a few short paragraphs. They were unlike anything Thomas had written before. Peaceful. Almost hopeful. If this page reaches daylight, then enough time has passed. The children have grown old. The governments have changed. The fears have faded. And perhaps, people are finally ready to understand that courage is not always found on battlefields. Sometimes courage is found inside ordinary people who choose to carry impossible burdens without asking for recognition. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Thomas had never asked to become a hero. He had never asked history to remember him. He had simply tried to protect others, and trusted that someday, someone honest would finish telling the story. David reached the final lines. His voice broke once more. If Eleanor lived a happy life, tell her I kept my promise. If she waited, tell her I'm sorry. But whatever happened, please don't let people remember me for disappearing. Remember me for coming home. David lowered the page. Silence filled the vault. Not the silence of uncertainty, the silence of understanding. After 78 years, Thomas Whitmore had finally come home. Not in uniform. Not through the front door of the house where Eleanor once waited. But through his own words. Through the promises he kept. Through strangers who refused to let history forget him. Rose gently smiled through tears. I think, she whispered, he can finally rest. And for the very first time since the impossible letter had appeared in my mailbox, it truly felt as though he already had. The drive back to the museum felt different. No one hurried. No one searched for another clue. For the first time since that weathered envelope had appeared in my mailbox, the mystery no longer belonged to unanswered questions. It belonged to understanding. The rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, bathing the quiet streets of Ashford in a warm golden light. People walked their dogs. Children rode bicycles. Someone watered flowers outside a small grocery store. Life continued exactly as it always had. Somehow, that seemed perfectly right. History had waited 78 years. It could share one peaceful afternoon with the present. Back at the museum, Helen carefully arranged everything on a large display table inside the archive room. The original envelope, Thomas's letter, the hidden third page, the journal, the silver key, the brass key, the engagement ring, Captain Monroe's unopened letter, the photograph, the newspaper clipping. Each object had once been a mystery. Now they had become chapters of the same story. Mr. Ellis quietly cleared his throat. I believe there's one final responsibility. David looked toward him. What do you mean? The law. He smiled gently. The contents of the safety deposit box now belonged to Thomas Whitmore's legal heirs. David nodded. I understand. But I don't think they belong in my house. Helen smiled. I hoped you'd say that. David looked around the room. My uncle spent nearly 80 years waiting for someone to tell the truth. If these papers disappear into another attic, then we've learned nothing. Rose looked proudly at him. Thomas would have liked you. David laughed softly through tears. I hope so. The museum's board gathered 2 weeks later. The decision was unanimous. A new permanent exhibition would be created. Not about war. Not about politics. Not about classified operations. It would simply be called The Last Letter. Visitors would see Thomas Whitmore's story exactly as he wanted it remembered. Not as a missing soldier. Not as a forgotten hero. But as a man who kept every promise he was allowed to keep. Several months later, newspapers across the state covered the exhibition. Historians visited. Military researchers requested copies of the journal. Families of other missing soldiers wrote letters thanking the museum for reminding the country that history is made not only by famous names, but by ordinary people whose sacrifices are almost lost to time. One afternoon, nearly 6 months after everything had happened, I received another letter. This one arrived exactly on time. The return address belonged to David. Inside was a single photograph. The museum's newest gallery. At its center stood the old wooden clock. Its hands remained permanently fixed at 3:47. Not because anyone had failed to repair it, but because no one ever intended to. Below the clock rested a small brass plaque. It read, "Sometimes history doesn't lose the truth. Sometimes it protects it. Asterisk. Until someone is finally ready to hear it. Asterisk." I stared at that photograph for a long time. Then I noticed something else. In the background, an elderly couple stood reading Thomas's final letter. The woman quietly reached for her husband's hand. He squeezed it gently. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Some stories aren't meant to impress us. They're meant to remind us. Remind us that promises matter. That love can survive silence. That courage often goes unnoticed. And that history, despite all its wars, governments, and headlines, is ultimately written by ordinary human hearts. A year later, Rose Bennett passed away peacefully in her sleep. She was 99 years old. Her daughter later told David that, during her final evening, Rose asked one last question. Did Thomas finally come home? David smiled through tears before answering. Yes, he did. She closed her eyes, smiled, and whispered only 3 words. I knew he would. As for me, I still walk to my mailbox every morning. Most days I find nothing more than bills, advertisements, and ordinary envelopes. But I never look at them the same way anymore. Because somewhere in the world, another forgotten letter may still be traveling. Another promise may still be waiting. Another family may still believe history has already spoken. Perhaps it hasn't. Perhaps history is simply waiting for someone willing to open the envelope. Thank you for staying until the very end and helping keep Thomas Whitmore's story alive. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to the channel. Every forgotten story we tell is another life remembered, another promise honored, and another piece of history rescued from silence. Because history only truly forgets when no one is left willing to tell the story.